Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. Hope burned out. A loud roar emerged from the giant construct as it began to move, the screeching of iron as it scrapped together giving the appearance of life and noise to the beast. Without waiting to see how much damage it had already done to Acknowledge, the giant beast lunged towards where it had slammed the dragon. Giant empty eyes seemed to lock onto the sight of a figure trying to push himself up from the ground, and without waiting the beast lunged, throwing its full weight down onto the figure as the iron that made up its body began to extend outwards into spikes. Before the beast could hit the ground, however, it came to an abrupt stop. Growling loudly, Acknowledge tightened his grip on the iron spike he was holding onto it, his claws digging deeply into the metal before he ripped the spike clean off from the iron dragon's body. Gravity immediately sprung to life on the iron dragon, falling down a bit more, right up until Acknowledge slammed a fist straight upwards and sent the construct hurtling upwards into the sky, iron raining down across the ground from where Acknowledge's fist had shattered the body. Despite the damage, however, the iron dragon showed no problems with moving, the hole made beginning to be mended by a series of extending pieces of iron. Moving its body in an unnatural way, the iron dragon tilted his neck round until its head could face towards the sky. Laxus! A voice roared out, Laxus glancing at the sight oddly for a moment before he recognized the voice and realized what Gajeel was after. Trying to ignore the pain from his chest, he forced himself back into his lightning form and shot upwards. Seeing him take off, Acknowledge growled at the sight of him before bending his legs slightly, getting ready to rush right after him with a powerful leap. With a roar and challenge, Acknowledge pushed off from the ground, preparing to fly directly in the line of Laxus's path upwards. Flames erupted in front of him the moment his feet left the ground, a densely packed wall of fire acting as a barrier as Natsu continued to push magic down from above. Uncaring of the attack, Acknowledge merely pushed straight through it, shrugging off the flames and ignoring the pric cling heat along his skin as he continued sailing upwards. This time an ice wall met his charge, 3 times wider and more than enough to divert his path if he went straight through it. It didn't change Acknowledge's goal though. Waiting right until the last moment, the dragon slammed into the ice before kicking straight off part of the rubble, bouncing from piece to piece before kicking off once more towards Laxus, altering his path to account for the time he had lost. This time though, the barriers that blocked his path weren't merely magical ones. Lunging downwards, God Serena allowed the elements gathered in his hand to mix. The earth summoned to his hand was quickly superheated before being blasted forward, his other hand coming up and firing down the coldest water he could summon. The 2 attacks struck directly, slowing Acknowledge down greatly while clouding his vision. Acknowledge's wings, however, summoned forth from his back, pushed him through the remainder and carried him upwards where Sting was waiting to meet him. "Oh no, you don't. Down you go!" Sting roared, increasing his light's intensity and blinding Acknowledge. Before the dragon could try and break his way forward anyway, he swung his fist down, darkness swarming up and mixing with the light before the combined mix slammed straight into Acknowledge. This time the dragon did come to a halt, his momentum finally stopped before being thrown backwards. That brief bit of hope was quickly crushed as Acknowledge summoned up his own magic, Sting recognizing the sign of the incoming breath attack. "Move!" he screamed, darting away as light while God Serena blasted himself with wind to the other side of the sky. Ice rose up in waves, last-ditch barriers provided to make the blast falter, but Toshiro could tell they wouldn't hold. Not against a breath attack. With a loud roar, Acknowledge fired the blast of magic upwards, aiming directly for Laxus himself. Even if it didn't hit him, it would be enough to force the Dragon Slayer to halt to avoid being struck. That would take time and would be time he could close the gap, this time unhalted by the others. By some miracle, however, Acknowledge's attack missed, clipping Laxus's side but not enough to make him falter. Momentarily shocked at the fact he had missed, Acknowledge glanced down at the odd magic he could feel before growling furiously as he felt its effects begin to fade, and with it the small boost of power it had granted him that had made him put too much strength into his body as he rushed to aim his attack. His senses immediately latched onto the path of the lingering magic and his eyes immediately met those of Wendy's, her hand being lowered as the magic she had used faded. Anger flew through his mind and suddenly all thoughts of chasing after Laxus were lost. He no longer cared what he did for the moment. Right now he simply wanted to tear out that little dragon slayer's throat. With a beat of his wings he was immediately flying towards her, Wendy letting out a small cry of shock before she immediately let herself drop from the sky. He made chase immediately, but resistance hit him hard. Where she fell freely, the wind parting before her, he felt like he was being forced to swim through the sky, the wind he had to pass through unwilling to let him chase after her easily. Despite the effort he had to exert though, he was closing in. Wendy's advantage in the sky could only last so long, and everyone knew it. Which is why as Acknowledge continued his chase, Taoshiro and Natsu moved to intercept. With a flame-coated fist coming from one side, bringing with it waves of fire that blocked off one direction, and a sword wrapped with ice from the other, walls of ice being dragged through the sky on the other side, Acknowledge had to quickly choose which path to break through. Halting himself briefly with his wings, the sword missed his neck by a few inches, the walls of ice slamming into him from one side and barely pushing him from his position in the sky. Natsu's strike came moments after, crashing into his gut and not even making him move. With a smirk fitting for a predator, he grabbed Natsu's arm before he could pull it free and squeezed until he crushed the bones into dust. Breaking bones didn't seem to be enough with that girl fixing them, so he had to start getting more creative if he wanted them to stay down. Natsu swallowed the cry of pain he almost admitted before he swung his other hand round, his palm open wide as the flames flickered to life in them, the only sign of danger being the increasing pressure from the wind. Acknowledge's grip immediately loosened on Natsu as he pushed backwards with his wings, the flames bursting to life before his eyes and filling his entire vision. One arm immediately came up to bear the brunt of the blast, taking the force of the fire dead on as it pushed him backwards. The magic didn't last long though, and when it did there was only singes across Acknowledge's arm, the scales that formed along it barely damaged in the slightest. Not enough, he growled out mockingly. He was about to return the favor with a spell of his own before he felt the spiking of magical power from above, his head snapping upwards to see the lightning coming down from the clouds and striking the iron dragon's mouth. Acknowledge's eyes widened as he realized the objective Laxus and Gajeel had been after, immediately shooting upwards even as the iron dragon's head began to tilt down towards him. The lightning that had struck the dragon was bouncing all along its body, focused with the most intensity around its mouth as it prepared to launch an attack he could only assume was a breath attack. Magic was quickly wrapped around his claws as he began to swing, knowing he wouldn't reach it in time without firing off an attack first, but Gajeel beat him to it. With a loud roar from within the giant beast, an avalanche of iron was released downwards, lightning dancing along every shard and holding them all close into one dense mass. His hastily thrown attack broke into the iron before fizzling out, incapable of holding up against the superior strike as it shot down towards him. Acting quickly, he brought both of his arms up before him before manifesting the scales of his dragon body across them, pushing his body's defensive capabilities to the max. But as the attack hit, he quickly realized that wasn't enough this time like the others. Ground was quickly lost unwillingly as he was forcefully pushed down towards the sky, and before he knew it his feet were pressing against the ground, the only thing that prevented him from sinking into it under the force of the strike. He didn't let himself be pushed any further. This wasn't the strongest he had faced. The only difference this time was that it was a massive mass of Dragon Slayer magic, the only thing he knew of that could actually start bypassing his strength to harm him directly. But if they thought this was enough, well, he'd have to correct them. His arms were slow to move, having to push back against the mass of iron as it continued to press down on him dangerously. He could feel his scales cracking under the pressure, but it wasn't dangerous yet. Moving his arms a bit further, he let his hands turn towards the mass of iron before he began to dig his claws into it, his magic being funneled through them. He couldn't rush this one. A wrong move could have the iron breaking through his guard and striking him. Lightning jumped across his body as he continued to push his claws in deeper before he began to pull his hands apart, the iron slowly beginning to split. Once the first part began to break, the rest fell easily to his strength as he began to pull it apart around him. The iron individually was weak, and it was only when held together by this lightning that it could hold itself together so well. If it had managed to score a direct hit on him, it might have done more. He couldn't help but smirk at the thought of their faces as he pulled the last piece out of the way, right until he saw the maw of the iron dragon's mouth right before him. Razor-sharp teeth slammed down on him as fast as they could, but this time he was faster, one leg slamming down against one of the teeth and shattering it while a hand shot up and caught a tooth by the point to prevent it slamming shut on him. From within the dragon though shot a figure, reverting from lightning at the iron before slamming a fist straight against Acknowledge's head. It barely made the dragon move though, and immediately Gajeel shot backwards, reverting to lightning again as he darted through the dragon's body, even as Acknowledge tried to swing out to grab him. Tired of the games with the dragon, he quickly raised his arm once again and swung upwards, energy flying off his claws and tearing the iron above him apart, the top half of the dragon's head falling free as he shot upwards. His eyes immediately sought out Laxus as he returned to the skies. He was the major threat right now since he could turn the iron dragon into a threat. He couldn't have gone far either. So if there had been any break to rest, there was likely one place he'd be with a wound like the one he had given him. His suspicions proved true when he spotted him being healed by Wendy in the distance, the other dragon slayers holding positions ready to halt his advance. Did they really think they could? Growling at the thought of such arrogance, he let himself drop back down towards the ground, one hand reaching out towards the iron dragon starting to recover. Before Gajeel had a chance to do anything, Acknowledge dug his claws into the iron and used it to get a solid grip on the giant construct before launching it straight towards its own allies. The other dragon slayers quickly began to scatter as the giant construct of iron flew towards them, its body crashing along the ground and forcing Wendy and Laxus to separate as they darted to different sides to avoid Gajeel. In that moment of chaos, Acknowledge struck. By the time the others had begun to realize the thrown dragon was only a distraction, he had crossed half the distance. By the time they realized he was almost upon them, only one of them was fast enough to actually stand in his way. He frowned for a moment at the sight of the blonde-haired dragon slayer in front of him, the light and darkness that danced along his skin similar to his own magic. Odd. He had expected the Ukin to be the first to get in his way. Not that it mattered. His hand closed into a fist as he swung them forward as he passed, expecting to hear nothing more than the sound of breaking bones of the magic-coated fist swung at him in turn. Which was why he was surprised when he only heard a grunt of pain come from the dragon slayer as he was forced backwards. Had he held back a bit? No, that wasn't the case. He had swung hard enough. So if it wasn't on his end, had his enemy gotten stronger? In the middle of this fight? Rapid evolution was possible in some individuals. He had seen it many times before, though not to this extent. He was sure that Strike should have broken the Dragon Slayer's fist earlier in the battle. How had the Dragon Slayer gotten this much stronger? His magic even felt more refined, more focused, more like his, he realized. His attention switched away from Laxus entirely as he brought himself to a stop and them immediately shot after the Dragon Slayer he had just sent flying. Leaving him alive suddenly became the worst-case scenario. Reaching the ground and sprinting across it, he followed the Dragon Slayer's falling form with his eyes, watching as he managed to recover in midair and roll across the ground as he hit it, immediately beginning to sprint towards him in turn. Did he really think that little jump he had made in power was going to be enough to help him here? He'd show him just how foolish he was being. Mirroring the Dragon Slayer's own actions, he brought back his fist once more and funneled magic into it. This time he wasn't going to just expend enough to do the job. He was going to wipe this Dragon Slayer out right now. As they both reached one another he began to swing, Sting hurrying to throw his fist forward too. It wouldn't work. He could tell just from the amount of magic he could sense behind that blow. His own would not only smash through it but also the flesh and bone that made up the fist. At least that's what he expected to happen. At the very last moment, a smirk appeared on the Dragon Slayer's face before he transformed, darting straight past him in an instant in the form of light. Immediately he turned to follow him, ready to catch up before the Dragon Slayer could get too far, only to face the broken form of the Iron Dragon rushing at him with the other Dragon Slayers following around it. So that was the Dragon Slayer's game. He wasn't running. He realized he had switched focus and began to try and capitalize on it. And he had fallen for it. How foolish. His instincts had dulled, it seemed. 400 years ago he would have seen a ploy like this because they could completely enact it. It seemed crushing enemies overwhelmingly had its downsides over the years. Still, it changed nothing. His target was still the same. Kicking off from the ground, he rushed after the fleeing Dragon Slayer, watching as he reformed behind the body of the iron dragon. The iron construct had taken a beating, its form caved in at some areas with the top half of its head still missing, but the way it moved hadn't changed. No matter how much it might resemble a dragon, it wasn't one. It wasn't as strong as one, but neither could it be killed as easily as one. Its core was the individual hiding inside. So perhaps it would be best to drag him out of hiding. As iron and fire were thrown down at him from above, he rushed underneath the iron dragon's body. It immediately tried to collapse down on him, using its weight against him, but he quickly slammed a fist upwards as it tried, knocking it upwards and into the sky like before. Trying to take advantage of the opening, God Serena rushed in, his hand brought back with iron wrapping around it like armor while flames glowed in the gaps, before he swung it down against the back of Acknowledge's head, the blow causing Acknowledge to stumble forward a step before spinning round and slashing out with his claws in retaliation. By that time God Serena was already retreating back, using bursts of wind to propel him away as quickly as possible. Another attack quickly came towards his back again, the drop in temperature alerting him immediately to the cause. Narrowly avoiding the sword aimed at the back of his neck, he spun back round and grabbed the blade before it could swing out of his reach. The Dragon Slayer immediately tried to lash out in response, his hands gripping the blade tightly and trying to pry it from his grasp, but it only served to keep him trapped. Then he swung the blade down and threw Toshiro into the ground. Before he could capitalize on it though, slashes of wind cut through the air between him and the Dragon Slayer, leaving deep gashes along the ground. He smirked at the sight of the youngest Dragon Slayer being so close, immediately kicking off from the ground and lunging towards her with one arm stretched out. This was obviously a trap, but he would have fun crushing it even so. As he expected, Laxus appeared in a burst of lightning. His wound had healed a lot, but he could still see part of the hole that he had made through the Dragon Slayer's chest. His main target was also quick to appear, trying to attack from the other side. Such a shame he didn't care enough about the other two attacks to worry about blocking them properly. Using his wings he forced himself to spin round, surprising the Dragon Slayer as he realized he had shifted his focus entirely. Lightning slammed against his back, but it barely hurt, even serving to push him forward. The other Dragon Slayer was trying to move, his body beginning to change to light, but he had already seen that trick. It was fast, but the time it took to change wasn't nearly that quick. Before the Dragon Slayer could change, he swung forward, using the air pressure from his swing along to blow the Dragon Slayer back to the ground. He immediately began to make chase, only to notice a scrap of iron fall in front of him, his eyes glancing up briefly to see the accelerating form of the Iron Dragon rushing straight at him, the wind parting before it and the magic that he could sense enhancing its body. He growled at the interference. Not this time. He roared, forcing himself to a stop as he raised his hands and caught the dragon head on. One arm struggled in his grasp, raising itself up to swing at him, but he was faster. His claws struck first, slicing straight through the iron limb and sending it flying upwards. With his hand still gripping the dragon he threw it to one side, ignoring its attempts to recover as he raised his head up, energy being drawn to his mouth. And then he brought it back down and roared. Iron shattered when the mass of energy he unleashed slammed into the dragon, not even allowing it the time to hit the ground. His attack didn't stop there either, slamming straight into the ground and causing the very earth to shake under the force as he destroyed the surrounding area. He doubted it killed them though. He might have destroyed a good chunk of the ground, but they were taking to their air fairly often. But that was fine. They would all be disorientated from shock for a few moments. Grabbing the arm he had severed as it began to fall down by him, he twisted it around until the jagged ends where he had severed the iron were exposed towards him. Yes, he muttered in amusement, turning his aim down towards where his target was trying to get up from the ground he had crashed into. Bringing his arm back, he added, "This will do nicely." With all his force, Acknowledge threw the iron forward, the lump of iron becoming a missile in his hands. Eyes widening at the sight, Sting tried to act in time, stumbling from the unstable ground as the aftershocks of Acknowledge's attack continued. The mistake cost him a second, and in that second he knew it was too late to dodge. He wouldn't be able to react in time. In that brief moment, he was prepared to die. And then something hit him, pushing him out of the way. His head spun towards the source as his body was flung rapidly through the air, the feeling of flames burning his clothes as he saw his last-minute savior. only for that shock to morph when he realized all that had happened was that he had been pushed out of the way, another taking his place. Spinning hastily at the last moment, Natsu flung his arms up and unleashed all the flames he had around him. He had barely made it in time to push Sting out of the way, propelling himself as fast as he could, which meant he had a lot of flames to call upon. In one blast they shot upwards at the projectile, hot enough that they would burn the iron away. Only he never got that chance. The flames rose but the iron was too fast, shooting straight through them and straight into him. In that instance, his flames died entirely. He was confused for a moment, simply staring up at Acknowledges with his hands held up towards him. Then they began to fall as his eyes turned to the giant iron arm that he'd been thrown into his chest, running straight through him. Blood dripped down onto the iron from his mouth as his eyes began to close weakly, unable to stay open as his mind drifted away. So this is what dying's like. He muttered weakly, all strength leaving him as the last bit of life began to leave his eyes, leaving nothing more than a corpse held up by the iron stuck in the ground. Protector of the fairies. No, God no, Levi whispered, tears falling from her eyes as she watched the sight in the distance with dread. Please tell me that he didn't. He's dead, Zeref muttered. That blow would have destroyed his heart and most of his chest. It's a miracle he's still in one piece with the size of that arm. Levi's head swung towards him, fury in her eyes at the sight of his uncaring tone. Don't you care at all? I thought he was meant to be important to you. He's your precious End, right? That he is, Zeref acknowledged. End is precious, and my little brother even more so. But if you think this is going to make me shed a tear, you obviously underestimate the lengths I'd go to in order to save him. Levi frowned at his words, the anger slowly dying away in place of confusion. Slowly, her eyes began to drift down towards the book she held, the seal holding it shut glowing brighter and brighter with every passing moment, almost as if it was struggling to remain in place. Your demons, they're tied to their books. Their life force is in them, aren't they? Correct, though End is a bit of a tricky one. I trust you memorized the contents correctly. Levi nodded. I did. The language was difficult though, I didn't understand much of it. And you don't need to, stated Zeref. Your job is merely to fix. To replace what gets lost. Memorization and speed, that is why I needed someone like you. The former is easy for me, the latter. I can craft thousands upon thousands of demons in the time it takes a normal individual to cast a spell, but my greatest creations require time to replace each and every word lost. And End is even more difficult since time is an important factor. But with you here, a girl who can create dozens of words as easily as breathing and can keep up with the rate of destruction, the damage can be halted and even reversed. Reaching forward, Zeref tapped the seal holding the book shut, the magic binding it shattering under his touch and causing the book to fly open. Words sprung out in all directions, arcing all around Levi as she struggled to keep track of them all. Within moments some were already beginning to fade, popping out of existence and causing her to spring in action. Her fingers quickly began a blur as she began to trace out symbol after symbol that made up the ancient language, desperate to keep up with the destruction of the book as it began to break in her hands. Your job, the reason I brought you here, has begun, Zeref declared, crossing his arms as he turned his sights back to Acknowledge. So get to work. Natsu has proven he cannot do much to threaten Acknowledge. It's time for End to try instead. Protector of the fairies. Natsu. Gajeel roared as he resisted the urge to lunge up in his dragon armor towards Acknowledge. His eyes were still locked on the sight of the arm he had made, pinning Natsu's lifeless body in place, and he didn't dare move in anger lest he be the cause of another dead. It wasn't like his dragon armor was doing much good. He had pulled as much iron as he could from the ground and then funneled his magic into it, reshaping it, and wearing it like a drive, the one thing he could claim to be superior in compared to all other dragon slayers. And for a time it had worked. The size made Acknowledge have to be wary of its blows, and the breath attack he had managed to construct, using Laxus's lightning to overcharge it and turn his normally weak projectiles into one massive dangerous shot, had done the largest damage any of them had done so far. But after that it had all gone south. It hadn't been enough to slow Acknowledge down or wound him, and Acknowledge had still been able to tear through his armor like butter. And now, Natsu was dead. And it was all his fault. Gajeel. He snapped out of his dark thoughts, hearing Laxus's voice. Yeah, he growled out, the head of his armor still staring towards Acknowledge as he turned his actual head slightly in order to give the illusion of being watched. What is it? Acknowledges going to move any second and kill Dash. He cut himself off, his eyes unable to help but flinch as he glanced against at Natsu's body. He couldn't take it, and his voice revealed it when he next spoke. He killed Natsu, he stated brokenly. With my own attack, Laxus. Not his own. Mine, one much weaker. What's that say about all of us? Can we even win? We have to, Laxus said back. I know. Natsu's, he's gone. But so will all of us if we don't keep fighting. Can you still do that? Fight for those still alive? Yeah, he could do that. It wouldn't be anything pretty or heroic. It would be nothing more than the desperate attempts of prey striking out at the predator, trying to survive. But he'd do it anyway. You got a plan? Wendy says she wants to try something. Told me before all of this. And Acknowledge seems to be quite focused on Sting right now for this to work. Just act as you have been. She'll do the rest. Roger that, Gajeel said before Laxus quickly darted away, returning to the sky as lightning. Act as I have been, huh? That was easier said than done. With one arm missing and his dragon missing bits and pieces, what he really needed was a chance to get some more iron out of the ground and repair his massive creation. But he didn't have time for that. All he had was a giant lump of iron that would be rendered useless if he lost too much more of it. Unless an idea was forming. It was a risky one he was sure the others wouldn't have approved of. It was suicidal. But that was fine with him. He didn't particularly care about stuff like that at the moment. And so with all the force he could push into his creation, he made it lift from the ground once more, letting out a roar in challenge towards Acknowledge before he pushed himself off the ground. The wings began to beat, taking him upwards as Acknowledge began to turn towards him. Was he being focused on now? Fine with him. He was sure Acknowledge felt pretty arrogant right now. So he was sure he'd never see this coming. Opening the mouth of his construct wide, he fired off iron from within. Whatever lightning he could add to it though wasn't nearly as effective as the massive ton Laxus had shoved into it before. The iron was probably being dented when it met Acknowledge's scales. But that was fine. He got the dragon's attention. Within moments Acknowledge was almost on top of him, having flown straight through the iron storm. He continued to fire iron as he began to move, lightning crackling around his body. It must have been like a beacon to Acknowledge because the dragon shot through the open mouth towards him. The second it did, he manipulated the iron as fast as he could and closed every single exit, plunging them into complete darkness, bearing the lightning that crackled around his body as a light source. The space was tiny, and he wasn't fast normally. But was also a cage of complete iron, with shards falling everywhere and beams holding parts in place. He wasn't fast normally, but as lightning he was incredibly powerful. From piece to piece he let himself get pulled from, using the metal's attraction to his form to move him at speeds otherwise unattainable to him. With each jump he reverted for only a moment, his arms in the forms of the sharpest blades he could make. The Dragon Slayer magic within them made them dangerous, but he had to revert back for a brief moment to strike, and for someone as fast as Acknowledge that was still enough. Blows that should have been lethal were blocked by scales, barely scratched by his blades, and cuts he managed to make were thin, barely leaking blood, and always ones he had been lucky enough to score. With each blow he already knew his chances of success here were dropping. With every jump he made, Acknowledge dodged faster and came closer to catching him in an attack of his own. The dragon was slowly stopping his attempts to last out ahead of time in place of observing the timings, and he knew soon he'd be caught with no chance to escape. Still, he could buy himself a few more seconds at least. With that he dropped any attempts of keeping his creation in the air, letting it drop like a brick straight towards the ground. The sudden shock threw Acknowledge off for a single moment, and in that time he appeared right before the dragon with a blade swinging for his neck. His blade shattered before it could react, a scaled arm coming up at the last moment. The look he was being given though told him that it was not by chance. Acknowledge had been waiting for that moment when he slipped up, even going as far to use his own mistakes to draw him in. So you're the next to fall? Pathetic. Raising his arm, Acknowledge prepared to slice straight down at Gajeel. Gajeel prepared for the worst, his free arm changing to the strongest iron he could make and being held up ready to try and put up a token defense against the blow. But right before it could swing, he wasn't there anymore. Instead he was staring at the sight of his own iron dragon armor falling through the sky about to hit the ground, and before it did he was witness to Acknowledge suddenly being smashed out through one of the sides of his creation and sent crashing into the ground. What just? What? How? You were meant to act normally, he heard Wendy, her voice taking on a ton of annoyance. Falling through the air in a suit of dragon armor is not acting normally. I almost couldn't lock onto you, and Nabara barely told me in time when to switch you. Switch me? How? He frowned as he turned towards her, dark and white light glowing around her chest and escaping through her clothes as she placed a hand over the source. Is that? Wendy nodded. Nirvana. I managed to escape this way, so I thought. Well, maybe I could switch some of us around. I wasn't sure if it would work or not, but I guess it did. Then who took my place? God Serena, Wendy stated. I didn't know if it would work, but he agreed since he had the highest chance of catching Acknowledge by surprise if we pulled it off. And I didn't want to mess it up with you all if I had the choice. Well, it worked, Gajeel muttered, glancing back over towards Acknowledge in the distance where ice was being fired down upon where he had landed to keep him pinned, God Serena's magic quickly lighting up in the distance and being joined by Laxus's own as they rained down attacks in turn. That won't keep him down for long, will it? Wendy shook her head. Nabara's keeping an eye on him, but he thinks we have another 5 seconds until. She paused at the sight of Acknowledge bursting upwards from the ground, grabbing Taushiro in midair before throwing him into an approaching Laxus and moving to focus on God Serena, the Ukin fleeing backwards in an attempt to buy some time. That. I need to go. Will you be alright here? Gajeel nodded. I'm fine. No injuries on me. I'll try and remake my armor if I can and get back in as fast as I can. Magic's running low though, so I'll need to eat a bit, first. He frowned as he felt his magic begin to recover rapidly, looking towards Wendy in confusion at the sight of the light around her picking back up again. Is this your doing? He asked in disbelief only to get a nod in response. How? I did this once before to help Guildarts, Wendy stated. It should top you up. Be as quick as you can. With that she leapt back into the sky, flying towards the fight. He sighed as she left, crouching towards the ground and feeling for some more iron. He'd need to try and drag out a large amount, and it didn't feel like there was much in this area. There was a good chunk near the surface nearby, though he could make use of if he shaped it well enough. Maybe enough to increase its density further, because the current level hadn't been nearly strong enough. He'd have to work quickly. He just wished it wasn't so goddamn hot. Natsu would have. His head dropped at the thought. Natsu would have loved this heat. And he was dead because of him. He couldn't help but look towards his fallen friend. Wendy must have been hiding close by because he could easily see the arm of his iron dragon. As much as he would hate to do it and to see the state of his friend, that amount of iron was a precious commodity. He needed it. And yet as he rushed towards the iron, he immediately knew something was up. It felt like it was getting even hotter there, and by the time he reached the arm of his dragon armor, all that he could see was its melted remains, dripping onto the ground from what little still stood. That's not possible, he muttered as a familiar figure began to stand, what had once been a massive wound through his whole chest now the size of a hand and shrinking. How are you? The face of his friend turned towards him, a confused look being sent his way, before Acknowledge's roar stole away its attention. And then Natsu smiled. It wasn't like any of his previous ones in Gajeel's mind. It looked different. Odd. Wrong. Natsu? Are you okay? Something was wrong. Natsu barely reacted to his voice, his attention too focused on Acknowledge in the distance. Was that a look of longing? He frowned before realizing Natsu's attention seemed to be actual on those fighting Acknowledge. He looked jealous even. This wasn't right. Natsu loved fighting, but this wasn't a fight for fun. It was a fight for survival. He wouldn't have been jealous in a time like this. Reaching out, he placed a hand on Natsu's shoulder, trying to shake him out of whatever state he was in. "Natsu, can you dash?" He never managed to finish his words, a fist slamming into his stomach before he could even realize and causing him to fall to the ground in pain, flames burning away the iron scales that had been present like they were paper. Something had broken, but he couldn't tell what in the pain he felt, his eyes barely able to look up at his attacker as Natsu gave him a sad childlike smile. "Ah! I broke him. Protector of the fairies. Support from the sky of twilight magic." Where was he? His head looked from side to side, familiar sights beginning to come into view. This was Magnolia, right? A small smile began to rest on his face as familiar sights began to appear around him. The markets where he would buy some food on the way back from a tough question, the cafe Urza frequently visited for her strawberry cakes, the house where Lucy had lived. There was no doubt about it. This was Magnolia. And yet why was it so empty? Where was everyone? Magnolia was never this quiet. It was never this empty. Even at night there was life in the city, and during the day like this, when the sun was bright in the sky, there was no way there shouldn't be people out there. He frowned, glancing upwards at the sight of the sun in the sky. Wasn't it bigger than usual? Like a lot bigger? It looked almost 10 times larger, probably even more, and the whole place felt hot. Not uncomfortably though. If anything, this entire place felt pleasant. Let's play, let's play." His head snapped back down at the sound of a child's laughter, the voice disappearing into the distance. "Is someone there?" He frowned more when he got no response, his eyes slowly glancing up further in the town towards the guild hall. The voice had been heading that way from how it sounded, and going there, it felt right somehow. One step at a time, he began to move towards the building. In what seemed like no time at all, he found himself before the doors, unsure of how he had even got there in the first place. The doors were already open for him, but the silence that greeted him unnerved him. The sight of inside only increased it further. Where was everyone? There should have been countless others here. For this place to be so silent, it felt wrong. It was wrong. Something was wrong here. So lost in thought, he didn't notice when the doors shut behind him, instead his attention being stolen by a table in the center of the large room. Was that a book? He didn't read much. He typically didn't care too much, and it definitely wasn't because he struggled half the time with doing so. Urza's Spartan training to help with that had beaten the basics into him, but also destroyed much of the desire to learn more beyond that, and he always tended to find his own adventures more fun than the ones told in books. And yet for some reason, he was drawn to this book. He hadn't even realized he was sitting down at the table, his hands reaching for the book. It immediately opened without warning, almost making him back away until he realized nothing else was happening. That was odd. What was this book anyway? He glanced at the first page briefly, immediately seeing the complicated language before him. There was no way he'd be able to read this. He could manage with the common tongue, but someone as weird looking as this, there was no way he could. He understood it. He couldn't tell what the words said, but he understood what they meant. Like the knowledge to understand it was a part of him on some level. For the first time in his life he truly felt himself getting drawn into a book, reading the first page before slowly turning it over to move to the next. He chuckled to himself briefly at the thought of what he was doing, all fears and doubts about the silence having vanished from his mind. This wasn't that bad. Though he wondered what the others might have thought of him reading like this. Gray would have probably rubbed his eyes in disbelief. Urza would have likely been proud that her teaching bore fruit. Wendy might have been curious of what the book was like too to draw his interest, and Lysina definitely would be. Wasn't there someone else who might have been curious too? Someone who loved books, enough to write her own. Was he forgetting someone? He frowned for a moment before the words drew him back in, turning another page as his doubts disappeared. Whatever he might have forgotten, it didn't matter. He could think on it later. Right now he just wanted to read. To understand. He never even noticed the rising temperature. If he had ever spared the time to go back outside and look, he would have seen the fire spreading at the edges of the world, consuming everything in its wake as it moved towards the guild hall. But he didn't. He only continued to read, and continued to forget. Protector of the Fairies. Are you sure this will work? Toshiro asked Wendy, the girl holding her hands against one of the remaining ice petals with an intense look of concentration plastered across her face. Not that I don't trust you or anything, but... Are you even sure this will work? About 50% sure, Wendy muttered, briefly glancing up from her work to glance at Acknowledge being held back in the near distance by a combination of Sting and God Serena. She couldn't see Laxus right now, not since he had taken a recent hit. If he was taking this long to get back into the fight, she should hurry and find him quickly in case he wasn't hiding and had taken too much damage. His injuries always seemed to be the worst to heal, like Acknowledge had a personal vendetta against him. Who was she kidding? Laxus was undergoing dragonification, his form halfway between human and dragon. Their enemy had a mile-wide grudge against anything even remotely connected to dragons. They were getting off easy in comparison to how much he probably hated Laxus's existence right now. She pulled her out of those thoughts quickly before they could drag her mood down, focusing instead on the task at hand. Drifting around the petal fragment in the air, she let her hands poke and prod it, her eyes watching every little reaction that occurred and noting the way it interacting with the world. I think this should work, she muttered. About 87%. I think. I feel so confident. That makes one of us, Wendy muttered under her breath, making sure she hadn't missed anything as she tried to record all she had seen to memory. The plan would work, but first she needed a chance to put it into action. Toshiro could fight at a distance, but this would be far more effective if he couldn't miss even if he wanted to and if none of them were going to be in the way. All right, she said as she turned towards Toshiro, floating down so that she was level with him. Quick question. How do you feel about getting really close to Acknowledge? I'd ask how first, Toshiro replied with narrowed eyes. What are you planning, Wendy? We're. She paused for a moment, glancing towards Nobara who was shaking his head before gesturing at herself. Did he not want to take any credit for this? He'd offered some of the advice. She felt bad for not giving him any credit, but she didn't have time to try and persuade him when Toshiro was looking at her expectedly like that. It must have been weird to others who couldn't see Nobara, what with how she had turned off to stare at empty space in their eyes. Forcing her attention back, she tried again. I've got an idea that can get us close to Acknowledge to deliver a crucial blow. One of our biggest problems so far is getting close enough to deal a critical blow. Anything dangerous enough to Acknowledge gets sensed early on, and if we try and firing it from range isn't that good. We lose power and give him too much time to react. And you can get me close to deal a critical one, correct? Wendy nodded. I can get you right by him. Just, don't be too surprised when it happens. All right. Toshiro frowned, wanting more clarification until he heard Acknowledge roar, closer than before. He turned his head just in time to see Sting get thrown across the sky and God Serena begin to make a runner. That attempt was failing though, and he'd be caught in a few seconds if he didn't act soon. Just give me some kind of signal when ready. What kind of dash? She didn't get to finish, Toshiro already speeding off towards Acknowledge. Sighing in frustration, she settled for heading towards Laxus like she had planned earlier. Hopefully Toshiro would take any major move from her as the signal and be ready to act when she caused a large enough of a distraction. Speaking of which, she better go find said distraction. Pushing off the air, she zoomed across the sky, keeping herself low to the ground to make herself more difficult to spot from Acknowledge's position. Now where had she last seen Laxus fall? Acknowledge had thrown him to one side when he had been facing in her direction, so, east a bit more? Or had it been west? It was east. Thank you, she whispered to Nobara as she continued to fly, the spirit keeping pace in the air beside her. She knew she should have paid more attention, but she had been so engrossed in trying to work out whether the plan would work. Speaking of which, you didn't want to take any credit? She asked curiously, glancing briefly at her grandfather just in time to see him shaking his head. I merely offered some advice based on the ideas you were beginning to formulate. I hadn't even considered the possibility you plan to put into action, so I do not wish to take any credit. But you're the one who offered suggestions on how to do it. Yes, but I'm merely facilitating your plan. You already had the core in place, you just needed a push on getting the last few steps working. Speaking of which, are you sure you will not need more assistance? Wendy shook her head. If you handle positioning, I'll handle the magic exchange. I wasn't studying Taoshiro's Bankai if I wasn't going to do it myself. Besides, I still have a better understanding of that than I do spatial manipulation. Worse so if it's not involving myself. It's better you handle that if we don't want to mess this up. And you wonder why I don't want to take credit, she heard Nobara said proudly. Just be careful, alright? Once you start doing this, I'm sure Acknowledge will reorganize his threat classification of you. Wendy nodded. I'll be careful, she said quickly, her eyes picking up a familiar shape. Ah. There's Laxus. Pushing against the air harder, she sped forward the last few meters before coming to a stop beside him, taking refuge briefly by the cover he had fashioned from a large chunk of earth. Laxus glanced up at her as she approached him, her hands already glowing green ready to burst into action, and she had to hide the flicker of shock she got every time she looked at him. She was sure he noticed sometimes. Enough people did it for him to notice, not that it was too surprising. His form wasn't something most saw every day and, he didn't look as injured as she was expecting. I'm fine, Laxus stated as she continued to stare, making a show of bringing his right arm up and showing the stream of lightning that connected it to his shoulder. See? Even my arm's connected once again. And the rest of you? Laxus shrugged a bit. Unfortunately for him, it had the side effect of making him wince, her eyes narrowing at the action. All right, maybe my ribs hurt a bit. Laxus. The pains being dulling with time, Laxus stated, Wendy staring at him in confusion. Don't believe me, try and finish the job if you want. She didn't need much promoting to do so. If Laxus wanted to put on a brave face right now, despite the situation, she let him and, You're not lying? She asked, glancing away as the glow around her hands disappeared. I don't. Her eyes briefly glanced at his chest before drifting to the section of scales. Yeah, Laxus said awkwardly, noticing what had caught her attention. They've spread a bit. In this battle? Yeah. Wendy could only stare at them in shock. Dragonification was meant to be a speedy process, but no one had ever given a proper time frame to it. Considering Laxus's current state and how fast he had progressed to this, and how long he had been able to hide his condition before then, there was only one conclusion that she could freely make. It's accelerating, isn't it? A simple nod was all the answer she needed for that. How? I don't know, Laxus admittedly hesitantly. It was never this fast before. It took a month to fully take over my arm and spread along some of my chest. But since I changed after fighting my future self, the process has been faster. Much faster. Maybe it's the existence of more dragonified cells. It was always a possibility, one Nobara seemed to be considering too, going by the thoughtful look he took on at her words. Perhaps the more dragon-like you become, the faster your humanity fades. Is that so? Laxus frowned before she could see an idea spark to life in his mind. Judging by the grimace he immediately showed, though, it didn't sound like it was a good one. Wendy, you and Nobara. Just how far does that power extend? What do you want me to do? She asked immediately. She couldn't afford to beat around the bush here, though she hoped he wasn't asking for what she thought he was. Could you force my body to accelerate the process? She paused, letting the dread from being correct settle in her stomach before throwing a look at Nobara for help. Can we? She asked, trying to keep sounding calm. She doubted it was working going by what she could hear from her own voice, but at least she was trying. Is it possible? Accelerating the process. Nobara took on a thoughtful look again, crossing his arms briefly and closing his eyes in thought for a few seconds. Maybe. This is new territory for me personally, but considering his current state, I'm sure I could find the element that makes up his dragon state. Accelerating it though. I'd need to add in essence from another dragon. Ideally a real dragon would be best, but I doubt we can manage that with Acknowledge going wild up there. A dragon slayer would do in a pinch. So it's possible, Wendy muttered, glancing back towards Laxus. Are you sure? You'd be throwing away any chance of reversing this. Oh, you don't know that dash. I do, she replied certainly, her eyes staring a hole straight thought him with their intensity. I can see it. If one side gains true supremacy, the other will be entirely wiped out. You can either be a human or a dragon. Once you become one of them, the other will be lost. Is that so, huh? Laxus asked calmly. Then my choice still doesn't change. I can't do much right now as a human. But I might be able to do more as a dragon. Wendy sighed. She couldn't quite tell if it was from disappointment that he was going to go through with this or relief that it would make her other plans more effective. All right then. Let me just focus for a moment. Triggering his evolution, speeding it up, there was only one way she could think of that would accelerate this drastically enough. She had watched the others enough to know that while they were stronger than her at the moment, she had a single difference to them. A pure state of dragon force. It was certainly true that Toshiro had his own state of it, but with the Shinigami power mixed and intertwined in it, she wasn't sure she could extract the energy necessary and separate it in order to implant it back into Laxus. God Serena might have worked, but if he had one he could enter easily he would have done so by now, and she couldn't afford to wait. Not when she was already using her own dragon force, one holding only Dragon Slayer magic and nothing else. She would need a good chunk though. It would make the rest of her plans difficult, but, well, she was sure she could recover her energy enough if she feasted on the air. Right now she couldn't afford to be stingy and ignore this chance. Her hand slowly came up to her chest, the magic of Nirvana glowing beneath her fingertips and transferring her the power she needed. Like always, the world seemed to change to her eyes and become so easy to understand. It was why it was so easy to then pull out some of her own magic, holding it within her palm and condensing it down into a small ball. You're good with medicine, you have to swallow, right? What's the dash? She didn't give him time to finish, taking advantage of his confusion to shove the orb straight into his throat before covering his mouth and forcing him to swallow it. He resisted for a few moments before finally managing to swallow the energy whole, a glare being sent at her by the time he was finished. What was that for? He growled out. Couldn't you have warned me? I didn't know if you'd have any complaints, she shot back nervously. And some patients tend to refuse their medicine if it's given a certain way. I thought you'd be less resistant if I surprised you with it. Well, it worked, Laxus muttered, giving himself a glance over before adding, but I don't think the magic did. Of course it's not going to work instantly, she stated. Accelerating the process doesn't mean causing it instantly. You need to give your body time to start digesting the magic. Normal Dragon Slayer magic might not have done much, but I'm currently in Dragon Force. I'm the closest thing to a dragon beside from you, so I'm a substitute here. Provided your body doesn't reject my magic, which hopefully won't happen since this is how the others obtained dual element modes. She paused for a second, glancing slowly towards Nabara. This should be the same theoretically? Why haven't we seen anything from Natsu or Gajeel? Or Sting? Theoretically this should have put them at risk of dragon-ifying. It is odd, Nabara responded, glancing oddly at Laxus before frowning. Are they not too far gone that the effects aren't that visible? Considering how rapidly individuals could undergo dragonification 400 years ago though. Wendy, this may be a bit rude, but how are you still human? What do you mean? Just that, Nabara replied honestly. You use your magic a lot. Perhaps not as much as those your age back then, but certainly quite frequently, even if you're just utilizing the healing aspect of it half the time. And yet you haven't shown any signs of losing your humanity like others back then would have by now. Neither have your friends either. Really? We should be different than we are. You should be. Which is why it confuses me currently why you aren't. I'm happy that you aren't, don't get me wrong, but it's still odd. It's not obeying the normal standards. Wendy. Wendy quickly glanced back towards Laxus, seeing him looking awful confused. Alright, she had just left him hanging while she had been trying to explain something and had then forced him to listen to one side of a conversation. She wondered if she'd get worse when she got older if she was already this bad right now. Sorry, where was I? Wendy gives Laxus part of her magic. Dragon Force Dragon Slayer magic plus the antibodies is responsible for his half-dragon half-human final state. provided my body doesn't reject your magic. Ah, that's right, Wendy replied back with a nod. Anyway, so long as your body managed to digest my magic, it'll give you an influx of new power. Not sure if it will affect you like how Natsu gained sky magic after eating my magic or how Gajeel obtained lightning magic after eating yours, but what's important is the dragon element held within. It should, and I say should because we'll taking a risk here on this working, trigger your dragonification and force you to transform further the more you use your magic, and if you use enough it'll probably push you all the way to the end. So if I was to use my legendary spell once I've managed to digest the energy properly. Wendy nodded. That would likely accelerate the process completely if you pack it full of Dragon Slayer magic. The act of drawing and wielding so much power will hasten the process immensely. I think. Be prepared for it to not happen if I'm wrong. I'm fine with taking the risk, stated Laxus, moving towards the edge of his cover before poking his head out towards Acknowledge. We left them long enough. Let's hurry back quickly. Yeah. Speaking of which, can you do me a favor? Depends. Will I like it? Probably not. Alright, let's hear it. Just distract Acknowledge. Draw his attention really and get really, really close to him. Like close enough to punch him. Laxus shot her a look and she could tell he thought she was crazy for suggesting that. Ah, what the hell, he muttered, letting out a sigh as he began to gather magic once again and shift into his lightning form. Can't lose that much at this point. Do whatever you need to do. I'll try and keep him occupied, but I won't be able to stick close to him for long. Choose your window wisely. I will, she said as Laxus shot off from the ground, quickly following after him herself as she took to the air. She wished they could have gotten better timings as they approached. Acknowledge was just in the middle of catching Taoshiro's blade, holding it in a tight grip before tearing it straight out of Taoshiro's hands and swinging it around so that the hilt slammed against Sting's head. God Serena was immediately swinging for the extended arm, his fist coated in earth before slamming it against Acknowledge's arm. It didn't make him drop the sword however, so he immediately brought his head back for a breath attack, one he was given time to finish when Acknowledge grabbed him by the head, his hand blocking his mouth and forcing the attack that was released to slam against his palm. The energy desperately tried to break free, hot flames trying to burn away the scales of Acknowledge's arm as they clawed their way through the gaps in his fingers, only to eventually fizzle out without leaving so much as a singe. Without so much as word, Acknowledge tightened his grip before throwing God Serena straight towards Laxus as he approached, forcing him and Wendy to scatter to avoid being hit by the thrown man as he was sent rocketing towards the ground. Switching his grip on Taoshiro's sword and taking it by the handle, he backhanded Taoshiro back as the Shinigami tried to reclaim his Zanpakuto before rushing down at the two of them. Get away, Wendy! Laxus roared quickly, taking the lead as he formed lightning in his right hand and switched back to normal briefly, hanging there for a moment in the air as his momentum carried him forward. In that time Acknowledge was swinging, the gap having been closed in moments, and aiming to slice him in half right down the middle. With the speed of the sword, he didn't doubt it could do that. So he did the best he could to stop it, his right arm coming up as the energy fired out in all directions around his arm. It didn't stop the blade, but it did make it slow down, fighting to break through the energy, and which meant when it hit his arm it didn't cut all the way through. Instead it made it a third of the way though. Letting out a roar of pain, he swung his other fist forward at Acknowledge only for the dragon to release the sword and use his wings to move back a few meters in the air, slamming a foot against the hilt of the sword and forcing Laxus to be sent rushing towards the ground. A sword to slay dragons against a human becoming one. How poetic, Acknowledge stated with a smirk, glancing briefly towards Wendy as a hurricane of air was sent flying straight at him. Raising one hand up to the attack, he took it head-on before swatting what remained of it to one side, not looking even the slightest bit tired from the action. Is that all? I guess healing is all you're good for. Get away from her. Acknowledge ignored the shout of Taoshiro as he rushed at Wendy, closing the distance before she could begin to back away and beginning to swing his claws at her. Die already. Her life flashing before her eyes, Wendy felt herself almost disappear like before. The urge was there, the desire to flee rather than fight this monster, and it was screaming at her at the top of her mind. She had the power to escape, and she could feel it within her grasp. With just a thought, a single destination, and she'd be gone. Just like before. She swallowed those fears this time. Last time she had acted out of sheer panic. This time though she knew what she had to do. Her grip on Nirvana lessened and instead her Sky Dragon Slayer magic erupted at full force, the wind strengthening along Acknowledge's path and making the action of slicing through her like walking through deep water. It didn't buy her much time, but it did allow her just enough time to drop, the edge of the claws cutting off some of her hair as she narrowly avoided death at Acknowledge's hands. He wasn't used to fighting small opponents, she reckoned. Humans that tried to fight him were normally at least a bit older than she was, and dragons, even children, were large beasts. He was too used to fighting those types of people, she reckoned, which right now was a lifesaver for her since he tended to get his aim slightly off when trying to kill her. Though this was really the first time she had managed to take proper advantage of it, so she couldn't say it was much of a weakness, just a chance to make another. This time she could feel Nirvana springing to life at her command. This wasn't quite what she had planned, but it would have to do. She'd just have to be quick. Space shifted. What was in one place was now elsewhere, and in the blink of an eye it was now Toshiro standing where she had stood, Acknowledge's arm having swung past and now causing him to overextend. Toshiro didn't have his sword, but he wouldn't need it in a moment. She just needed that moment. Freeze him. Toshiro didn't need much prompting. He may have lacked his swords, but it didn't stop him slamming his ice-covered hands against Acknowledge's chest, sacrificing his wings and letting the ice extend forward to cage Acknowledge in a prison of ice. Knowing previous attempts though, the prison would be lucky to last 2 seconds. But it was enough for her. Diving into her memories, she brought everything she had committed to memory back to the surface, Nirvana ready to put her plan into action. Toshiro's form was clear to her, as was the petals that remained of his Bankai. From the original 12, only 5 remained. And now she'd bring that down to 0. She could feel the pull of Nirvana, drawing her in deeper into that world no one else could perceive. Light of black and white was intertwining all around her hand as she extended it forward, aiming directly at the remaining petals. She could see the magic clearly held within them, acting as containers and slowly filtering the magic back into Toshiro. After examining his Bankai, she had a pretty good idea of why it did this. It was a safety mechanism. His Bankai's power released so much magic instantaneously that it was dangerous for his body to immediately utilize it. So it condensed it down into 12 petals to safely filter it back into his body until all 12 shattered. That also meant that if he could obtain the energy from the petals earlier, he would enter his Bankai's true state earlier. She wished she knew what would happen if she did this though. The current method was the safest one, and she was about to transfer 5 petals worth of magic directly into his body. However, she didn't have time to worry about the consequences when Acknowledge would retaliate any moment now. So doing her best to forget the consequences for the time being, she let the magic's position in the world shift. Where before it was in the petals, now it would be within his body. She knew something was wrong the second Toshiro cried out in pain, clutching his chest and falling to his knees. Acknowledge unfortunately chose that moment to break through of his prison, the ice being flung in all directions, before he stabbed an arm straight towards Toshiro, intended to pierce his heart, and... Why could she see her breath? A chill entered the air, Toshiro's eyes looked up to meet Acknowledge, and then suddenly there was a new ice sculpture where Acknowledge had been. Toshiro began to get back to his feet as the ice fell towards the earth, most of the ice that clung to him previously now gone with thinner layers across his arms and legs. That was more painful than I thought it would have been, Toshiro said to Wendy, glancing down towards the falling ice as it began to crack and shatter. Damn, he muttered at the sight of Acknowledge having forced himself free. I'd thought I could have held him for longer. Guess I need to do a deep freeze to keep him down. Wendy, can you put me in front of him right now? Wendy tried to respond, but suddenly speaking seemed like an impossible task. The world shifted back to normal to her eyes and she could feel the pull of the earth starting to affect her again, dragon force struggling to keep her afloat. Wendy? Wendy? She could hear Nabara's panic, but it was drowned out by a scream of her own as her dragon force suddenly failed. Without it nothing was there to keep her in the sky, and she was falling like a rock. She needed magic back fast. If she didn't get some she'd hit the ground hard, and there was no way she could survive a drop from this height. There was no guarantee the others could reach her in time either to save her either. Opening her mouth as wide as she could, she tried to pull in as much air as she could, even going as far to spin herself over to try and use her fall to easily gather air to devour. It wasn't working fast enough though. To stop her fall she needed dragon force again. Just how much magic had she burnt through to suddenly drop so low that she couldn't maintain it anymore? She wanted to slam her head against a wall when the answer came to her. It was because of Nirvana. She knew it was a costly piece of magic, but she had been using it anyway, and not just once either. To escape once, to save Gajeel, to help with Laxus's request, to switch places with Taushiro, to force his Bankai to release completely, and who knows how many other times in smaller ways when it could help tip the flow in their balance. Trying to use it so rapidly in quick succession, without time to recover, had drained her completely. She wouldn't be able to eat enough air in time. She couldn't do it, plain and simple. Even if she could, it would never all digest in time to be transformed into magical power. What she needed right now was a massive chunk of magical power, as much as she needed to trigger Dragon Force once more. Couldn't she do that actual? Nirvana was a lacrima and she knew it still held a bit of magic left in it. When she used it she drew from both herself and the energy stored, with the latter taking on most of the strain for hard jobs. But Dragon Force running out merely meant she couldn't maintain it with her reserves, not that the lacrima was out of magic. It could work. She had done it before, once on herself and once for Gildarts. The latter was a memory she remembered more strongly, and if she did it once she could do it again. Gather, she muttered in an attempt to focus herself, desperately reaching for what little magic she could grab from the lacrima and using it to fuel the spell. She barely managed to pull herself back into that state of seeing the kind of things Nabara saw, the sight hazy through one eye, but she could see it and knew what she had to do. Now all she had to do was pull. Energy was drawn in, as rapidly as she could, and she could feel her body protesting from the action. But at the same time she could feel strength returning, her magic reserves being replenished. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going briefly, and with it she felt her dragon force finally reignite. She caught herself with seconds to spare, the ground far too close to comfort. With a sigh of relief, she glanced back around briefly, trying to spot the others, only to find Acknowledja almost right on top of her, his arm swinging down and releasing slashes of magic at her. She was pretty glad honestly when her dragon force faded again at that moment and had her fall the rest of the way down. It meant the energy sailed over her head. Hitting the ground though wasn't as satisfying, not when she felt her leg break from the impact. Screaming from the pain, she tried desperately to struggle through it and move, but Acknowledja was much faster. He landed right before her, his fist brought back, others shouting out at him and desperately trying to reach him in time to save her, and then she saw it. Acknowledja's eyes widened, his gaze locked on something above her, his arm seeming to halt its momentum from pure shock, and then a fire-coated fist slammed its way straight into Acknowledja's face, with enough force to send him flying backwards. Looking up at her saver, she had a thank you on her lips towards God Serena before the words got caught in her throat. That wasn't God Serena. Wow. He flew so far. That voice, that face. She recognized the latter. That was Natsu. But, that was impossible. She had seen him die saving Sting. They all had. And yet now he didn't have a single injury on him, the giant hole in his chest gone with only the rips in his clothes to show that anything had happened at all. But the voice was the weirdest part. It was Natsu's voice, but it didn't sound like him. The way he spoke, the emotions used, he sounded different. Younger, even if she was to guess going by the excited light that seemed to shine in his eyes, despite the situation they were all in. Natsu hadn't shown anything like that before. What was going on? She barely had time to think before the pain started to overtake her mind again, slowly causing Natsu to look towards her from her whimpering. It was hard to tell, but he looked confused, and his words only seemed to confirm that. Are you broken? The light in his eyes seemed to shine brighter, however, when he pointed out towards the direction he had sent Acknowledja flying and added, does that mean I can play with him instead? He looks fun. She managed to nod, obviously an answer this person, because she couldn't quite consider him Natsu with how he was acting, wanted, and without another look at her he was charging off towards Acknowledja, propelling himself with flames. He didn't seem to care about the danger they posed to her either. the flames almost burning her as he took off. Before they could, though, a barrier of ice was protecting her, Toshiro by her side and lifting her into his arms. "Let's get out of here quickly," he muttered, rapidly retreating back with her and trying to find somewhere safe to place her down out of sight. All the while she couldn't help but stare back in the direction Aknowledge was, the sight of flames bursting to light worrying her. Because if that wasn't Natsu, was that End? Protector of the fairies. A dragon vs a demon. End was strong. Those thoughts had always been in Aknowledge's mind. He had faced End only once before, over 400 years ago, and even now he still remembered the injury he suffered at the demon's hands. It had taken months for his skin to heal properly, the cursed flames lingering and preventing his magic from speeding up his recovery, and had taught him the foolishness of trusting Zeref at face value. It had been that day that he had learned that his usefulness to Zeref had begun to wane. From that day he had never fully trusted the man. He owed him a great deal, he wasn't one to forget or ignore that, but he had also learned something too. He had become too strong in Zeref's eyes, strong enough to actually be a threat. End was the pinnacle of Zeref's demons, and he had managed to do what dozens of dragons failed to, and if he hadn't realized the danger at the time he might have died that day too. 400 years had passed since then, so many years that had sometimes felt so slow waiting through them for the final dragon slayers to reappear, having been hidden away by the desperate attempts of Zeref and what remained of the living dragons, and yet he had never forgotten the sensation of those flames or the signature of that cursed magic. It had been smart of Zeref to have never revealed E.N.D's face to him back then. It had preventing him from realizing when he first encountered the Dragon Slayer, but he had learned the truth over a month ago when the seal finally weakened. The sight before him though was pure confirmation. This was End, not a fake or a trick but the real demon. Those flames still burnt just as hot as before. His arm brushed away some of the lingering flames around him that he had taken from the blow, wincing at the brief bit of pain that spread across his scales and penetrated further down to his skin. He had faced many forms of fire before. Fire as cold as hell, fire as hot as the sun, but E.N.Ds was unique. It was the only flame that his strength was rendered useless against. No matter how strong his magic became, no matter how much magical power he accumulated, it didn't matter. Those flames would still burn through his scales. The years had only served to make the demon stronger too. Its curse remained the same but its magical power had grown greatly to the level it was now, and he could only sense it growing higher thanks to Zeref's influence. With the two elements put together, they made for a bad matchup for him. If there was anyone that was an enemy that he feared, it was End. And yet he felt himself smiling, his body shaking not from fear but from anticipation. He had never cared enough to hunt down End after Zeref's attempts to get rid of him. He had been more concerned with the dragons remaining and the dragon slayers he'd have to wait to get to. And yet fate had an odd way of bringing things back. One of the dragon slayers he wanted to kill and the demon he wanted to destroy. What were the chances that they'd be one and the same? That Zeref's masterpiece wasn't purely a demon but a demon with the power of a dragon? This was the ultimate weapon designed to kill him. And it wouldn't be enough. Looking up from the flames he had brushed away, shredding away the contaminated scales and letting new ones form from his magic, he picked up E.N.D's approach surprisingly easy. The demon was moving quickly, propelling himself forward with massive torrents of flames, in a path that was straight towards him. That part would be a pain he realized, noticing how, despite the massive amount of magical power being used in that technique, he didn't sense even a drop in the demon's magical power. No, if anything it was probably rising still, replenishing energy previously lost. He knew what Zeref was doing. The man was Nukin, with access to the world's source of magical power. He could pull as much as he wishes and it would come willingly to his aid, but it was never Zeref who made the most use of it. It was always funneled into the creation of more demons or the maintenance of those already on the field. Right now he doubted Zeref had any plans to involve the former, they'd be nothing but ants before him, and was instead focusing all his strength into ensuring End was as strong as possible. It was a smart move, if the demon itself wasn't so predictable with where he was going to attack. He could wait for End to reach him but that would take longer than he wanted to wait. He wanted to kill End now, especially after the fact that he had yet to take down any of the dragon slayers thanks to their desperate attempts to cling to life. The result was never going to change. He would win if the fight lasted long enough, but he didn't want that. He'd rather crush them completely and not let anyone claim he only won because they ran out of power to draw from. Which is what led him to leaping forward, the ground shattering under the force of his feet as he rushed straight at END to meet him head on. If END wanted to be predictable, that was fine with him. It would only make this so much sweeter. By the time the demon seemed to realize what was going on, it was far too late. E.N.D.'s flames died in one hand, the remaining flames pushing him to one side, but his claws swung true even so, and he saw blood spray through the air as he cut straight across E.N.D's throat. That should have been the end right there. Despite E.N.D's best attempts, it had been too late to try and dodge. He had been meaning to sever the demon's head, but tearing out his throat was still a death blow. So much blood tended to spill from such injuries, and he had seen enough to know that it was fatal. He was surprised when a fire-coated fire slammed into the back of his head right as E.N.D's body begun to pass him. Stumbling forward from the harsh blow, the flames burning away at his flesh as he quickly discarded the caught scales in an attempt to weaken their hold on him, he spun round to search for the source only to have another first coming straight at him. He ducked quickly beneath the blow, ignoring the pain from the flames as he swung a fist of his own up and slammed it into the arm of the one daring to strike him. The bones beneath it shattered under the full force of his strike, and his opponent was momentarily blasted upwards towards the sky. Not even a second into that, however, the same figure came rushing back down, flames halting his momentum completely and pushing him straight back down, where he struck downwards with the same arm that had just been broken, releasing a massive wave of flames that spread across the space between them in an arc. Avoiding the flames with a single step to the side, the heat from them beginning to be felt by Acknowledge, he glanced over at his attacker before a frown crossed his face. It was END. But he had ripped out E.N.D's throat. An attack came straight at him, forcing him on the defensive as he began to weave through attack after attack, many coming close and leaving him no room to easily retaliate. A single chance appeared though as the demon brought both arms back, flames spiraling out from both hands and being brought into one massive sphere behind the demon's head, and in that moment he shot forward, his claws slicing through the air and tearing off one of E.N.D's arms in the process. The loss hardly seemed to bother END, however, the demon turning to him with an innocence in his eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time, before uttering a single word with joy. Catch. He blinked, and in that time the unstable ball of fire was straight before him, giving him no room left to avoid the blow. His right arm shot up as he leapt back, the flames slamming into the limb rather than just chest and spreading their deadly curse across his arm. The pain was almost unbearable for a moment. He had known how little his scales would do, but taking blows and taking a strike like this were different things entirely. But he was starting to learn the quickest way to deal with the flames though. The scales on his arm had already been mostly burnt away, leaving nothing but flesh in the way of the flames. If left alone it would burn his flesh beyond recognition, but he didn't have to leave it long, quickly slamming his arm against the ground a few times and using the hard enough to pad out the flames. It was, at its core, a basic strategy. The flames would linger so long as there was magic to feed off. So he threw away his scales that protected him to starve them of fuel. Once they lost that, they were like any normal flames, dangerous and painful but able to be put out without their previous interference. Though it helped a lot more when he could simply discard the scales and have them take the flames with him, but some attacks were strong enough to break the scales entirely, requiring a more manual touch. None of this stopped the flames being a troublesome threat though, and his wariness of E.N.D's power was growing after this latest display. He had killed END. He was sure of that. But then he had done the same to him before he turned into END earlier. He'd ensured that there was hardly much of his chest remaining from the chunk of iron that had been stabbed into him. But despite that, END was still here, fighting him. Somehow he had recovered from a fatal wound, not once but twice. He hadn't been wrong when he tore out E.N.D's throat, it was just that the demon had recovered from it. How though? Was it a form of immortality like Zeref's? No, that certainly wasn't it. He knew about Zeref's wish to get rid of his own immortality, and its potent strength would have made it impossible to be replicated. What was occurring here definitely felt similar, but there was no way it was the same. He just hadn't seen the cause of it yet. Eyeing his enemy cautiously, he shifted some of his focus briefly to sense the other dragon slayers. None of them were making a move during this time. Were they regrouping? Taking advantage of E.N.D's appearance to recover some strength and heal their wounds? He supposed it would make fighting END and learning his tricks easier, but he couldn't let them sit around freely for too long. There was still that familiar dragon slayer with blonde hair to worry about. He was learning how to use his power, a power too familiar to be a coincidence, faster than he would have liked, merely from copying his own use of it. With that in mind, he should try and make this quick. He took a step forward, preparing to rush END, only for the demon to make the first move, his own movements like a trigger for the demon. Immediately he had to avoid a blow being swung at his head, the flames that spread forward singeing some of his hair as they passed, before retaliating with a blow straight to the demon's chest. His attack hit empty space, however, when END immediately dropped down to the ground by intensifying the streams of flames from one hand, the arm being swung in an arc to then bring the demon crashing straight up into him. He caught the fist that tried to slam into him with one hand, a fist that really shouldn't be there considering he had torn the arm off, and tried to ignore the flames for a moment. As he brought his other arm back down, he didn't expect END to escape by ripping his own arm off, a blade of flames held in the demon's hand as he avoided the claws with a single step back. Then, without caring about all the blood flowing from the wound, END charged in again, a wide smile across the demon's face as he detonated the flames in his hand and blinded them both. Swinging wildly, Acknowledge felt his claws connect with something. However, as the flames began to dim, they immediately were replaced by an even brighter light, and he found the demon right in front of him, his remaining arm grabbing him by the shoulder while blood poured out from the gash wounds across his neck. Blood that was being quickly mixed with flames, he realized, the magic leaking out from the edges of E.N.D's mouth and through the holes in his throat. He hardly had time to react. END let out a roar, the breath attack being unleashed at close range, and he did the only thing he could. He roared back. Roared louder than he might have needed, the shockwave shattering the ground all around them and forcing some of the opposing magic to immediately scatter. But not enough of it. His attack was still one that held magic in it, and the demon's curse only fed off it. All it could do was buy him time. Pressing his feet against the ground, he kicked back as he continued to roar, his wings opening up wide from his back and beating quickly to bring him upwards. The flames finally broke through his roar as he began to rise, and he quickly pulled his body up as they swarmed forward, barely avoiding the destruction they caused along their path. As if not satisfied with the result, END had rushed towards him before his attack had even started to fade. His speed with those flames was quite impressive, he would admit, to outrun his own attack when going at full force, but when charging the demon because far too predictable, easy enough to swat down from the sky and straight into his own attack. One thing he couldn't not notice, however, was the fact END had two arms again. It wasn't as fast as Ziref's, he could confirm that now since he could actually see the demon with injuries, so if he was to compare it to anything it was more like that hybrid that Ziref despised so much. Except, it still felt different. Was this normal regeneration? Watching as the flames below began to die down, he got a proper glimpse at the demon's regeneration in action. His claws had left marks when he swatted the demon down. Deep ones too. If it had been regeneration, he would have expected the wound to be healing rapidly, but it wasn't that. It was like the damage was being overridden. The wounds had gotten smaller, but the parts remaining still dug in just as deep as the rest would have done. So that's your game, Ziref, he muttered. He understood now. How foolish of him to forget. No matter how much changed, no matter how fearsome or strong the demon was, it was still one of Ziref's demons. It was an artificial construct, made from ancient languages and complex formulas, broken down into phrases and stories that Ziref could use as focuses. If END was like the other Aetherius demons, he probably even had a book that held all the words that had made him who he was. And a book could be repaired. No wonder Ziref was content to watch from the sidelines. This was his role. Whenever END suffered any damage, the signs of it would show up on the book. The condition of the book was the condition of END itself. But the same could be said in reverse. The condition of END could be directly influenced the condition of the book. If one was to repair the damage that would show up, to put it back to its original state, the changes would flow back to END itself. That was why the wounds were healing in such a way. It wasn't regeneration but reversal, his form being rewritten to its original state. This fight wouldn't end if that was the case. Ziraf truly had created his greatest masterpiece. A demon that would never die so long as he held the book, with power to overcome any user of magic, no matter their strength, given enough time. Which meant his target shouldn't be the one in front of him but the one hiding away. Except he didn't have the faintest clue where that dark mage was hiding. He could be miles away, using the book's condition to know when to fix it. But that didn't seem like him. In times like these, Ziraf had a tendency to try and be close to the action. His immortality left him afraid of very little, least of all death, and so he made it a habit to observe close up. He wondered if Ziraf realized that bad habit of his, especially when holding items nowhere near as durable as he was. If he was close, he could track him. He had no doubt the man was hiding his magical power at least, but if he wanted to fuel END, then there was one thing he couldn't hide. The connection he had, the path he was fueling magic through. Right now it was being masked quite well. E.N.D's wide use of magic was submerging everything else, but if he could quiet it for a moment, he'd have him. "Oh, are you done recovering?" he asked, noticing END was back to his feet with that same happy smile glued to his face. "You seem to be enjoying this." "Of course." END replied happily, going as far as to close his eyes and bob his head from side to side from pure joy. "All my other toys keep breaking. But not you. You're the best one I've ever played with." A toy. He had thought something was up with this demon, but now? "How old are you?" "How old?" END paused for a moment, opening his eyes and counting across his fingers. 1, 2, 3, what comes after 3? He struggled for a moment, scrunching up his eyes as he tried to remember before completely giving up a second later. It doesn't matter. Come on, let's play some more." Spreading his arms out wide, he let fire run across the full length of them, falling downwards to the ground like a waterfall and burning away the ground. "I'm having so much fun." So that was it. The final mystery he hadn't been able to work out about END. At times the demon's movements had been predictable, charging straight at him like he believed that would easily work. Then, once he was close up, he took chances and risks no sane fighter would take or make. It had made him hard to read at times, and now he knew why. For all the power the demon had, for all its strength and danger, one thing truly separated him from everyone else here. END was a child. It wasn't an age, not when that pesky girl was smaller and younger than the demon. It was the mentality. Despite her age, that girl was a fighter. He had faced children even younger near the end 400 years ago, when the dragons had gotten desperate and sent everything they could, including hastily made soldiers from orphans. And all of them shared a single thing. They had the mindset involved to fight. END had none of that. He wasn't fighting to harm, to defeat, or even to kill. This was merely playing for the demon. He was having fun playing with a toy that didn't break in one hit. Life and death wasn't even considered as part of the equation. And because END was playing, was truly a child in all aspects apart from body, it made his movements harder to predict at times. He knew exactly what he could do with his magic, was seeing how he recovered from wounds, and took that all into account with his games. "And they call me cruel," Acknowledge muttered, staring at the demon for a moment in pity. In another life, he might have spared the child. But he had lost too many of his old morals to even consider sparing him. If the demon wanted to curse anyone for his eventual fate, it would be Ziraf for creating him and forcing him into this mess. "All right then, let's play." Darting straight towards END as he uttered those words, he saw the demon's smile widen before he began to swing his arms down, the flames erupting outwards across the ground and beginning to stretch back up as they spread. He ignored them as he landed on a small safe spot in front of the demon, a rock yet to be consumed by them acting as foothold for him, and immediately swung out and knocked the demon back. Before the flames could try and reach up and consume him, he leaped back off the rock, chasing after the demon he had sent flying. It was never going to go down easily though. END recovered mid-flight, flames lighting up around his hands and spinning him over and propelling him back towards him. That same wide smile was present, the demon appearing to be having so much fun. He wondered how long that was going to last. Seeing END raising an arm up, he quickly dodged to one side as torrent of flames was fired forward through the air, narrowly missing one of his wings as he tucked it in. Hitting the ground running, he closed the distance before END could fire off another strike and slammed a fist straight against the demon's head. He heard it crack, the head bending back at an unnatural angle, and for a second or two the flames died down. But as quickly as they died, they burst to life once more and E.N.D's head snapped into place. One flame-coated fist swung forward and he counted before END could throw his full force behind the blow, using his own superior strength to push straight through with his attack despite the flames burning away at his arm. Killing END briefly wasn't going to work, it seemed. Not when its magic was still so wild. He needed to crush him for long enough to reveal the source. He needed a much stronger attack. With that in mind, he let END swing at him before catching the demon's arm and pulling him forward. His knee immediately slammed into the demon's gut, and while he was still recovering he shot past him and slamming a fist against the demon's back, knocking him to the ground from the blow. Flames burst out all around END, acting as a barrier, but he had no interest in following up an attack just yet. No, he had a different plan in motion. So instead he shot upwards, his wings expanding and pulling him up rapidly before END had time to realize what was going on. Magic gathered quickly to his will as he brought his head back. He didn't need to go full force here. He'd waste too much time with something that wouldn't even kill END permanently. So instead he'd settle for enough for this plan. With all the energy he needed gathered, he did the one thing dragons were known as. He roared. It wasn't like his previous ones. Those attacks were meant to shatter opposing magic through force, to crush weaker foes. This time, he was doing his own breath attack that the dragon slayers loved to throw around. END looked up too late to stop him, and even the flames fired towards his roar wouldn't stop it. E.N.D's flames were powerful, and they might be able to burn away his magic. But they could only do that so far. He just needed to hit END with an attack so superior that his flames couldn't devour it all before it crushed him. And as he expected, the attack hit. It smashed straight into the demon and the explosion carried outwards, tearing about the nearby landscape and causing the wind to pick up wildly. He was sure the other dragon slayers had seen that, had seen the devastation it had caused, and would soon see the massive crater it would have left in its wake. But for now, he had something more important to do after that show of force. E.N.D's magical power had finally died down enough, suppressed by his own, for him to get a clear picture again. It took a few moments, and he almost thought he wouldn't locate it in time and END would recover. But by the time he started to sense the return of that familiar magical power, a smirk was growing across his face. END wasn't a concern anymore. He didn't even need to stay and fight him at the moment. No, he had a different target. Ignoring the shouts from the demon, he took off away from it, heading to the location he had sensed that familiar magical power from. He knew where Ziref was hiding. Protector of the Fairies. Breathing heavily as the strain of her magic began to take a toll on her, Levy swore to herself quietly at the state of the Book of END, its pages becoming torn with words spilling out in all directions. As quickly as they appeared, her eyes tracked them, noted them down and compared it against the ones in her memory. Immediately the book was flipping through pages, connected to her thoughts thanks to Ziref and coming to a stop on the page she wanted. It looked unharmed though, which meant it wasn't this one, and the pages quickly shifted once again as she moved to the next possible location. This time she got a hit. She could see the damage clearly and as if on autopilot her hands sprang into action. Words formed with each movement of her fingers, filling in the blanks and taking the spots of the damaged or destroyed words. With the page complete, she could now ignore the words she had seen that had now been fixed. The pages continued to flick to her next target and the process was repeated, again and again and again. Sometimes it was easy to manage. Sometimes Natsu took only a small bit of damage. Other times, she reckoned he took something serious. There was one point that he must have taken some fatal damage as she had almost been unable to keep up with the book's deteriorating, only managing to prevent Natsu's death by ignoring most of the damage and focusing on the source that was killing him as a priority to repair. Problem was that he was taking more and more risks. She could see the flames in the distance, they were definitely his, but no one else was throwing around any magic near him. He was fighting Acknowledge all alone, which explained all the injuries he was taking, but it was still a foolish move. Even if he was somehow managing to keep Acknowledge's attention on him with only, well, she wasn't sure how many deaths it was. He'd come close a few times currently though. This time was the worst out of all of them though. She had seen the devastation from a distance that Acknowledge had caused. They'd all known he would have a breath attack of his own, but seeing just how much damage it caused was still hard to believe. And Natsu had been hit by that. It was no wonder he was so badly damaged. He probably had even died, which would explain why the book was deteriorating so quickly. It was starting to slow though. With each word replaced, with each of the more critical areas restored, the rate of words being flung at her decreased. She just needed a few more seconds and she should have him back to prime condition. "We've got company." She paused in her work, glancing up at Ziref in confusion. He had been oddly quiet for a while now, simply staring at Natsu in the distance as he fought. She had long lost the ability to keep up with what was happening at such a far distance, but it had appeared like Ziref had little trouble doing so. For him to finally break his silence to say something like that. Her eyes snapped towards the distant fight and realized why Ziref had spoken. It was hard to see, but with Acknowledge staying so still it appeared that he was looking in their direction. Right at them in fact. "Oh. He found us," she muttered weakly, realizing just how much danger they had suddenly been thrust into. "How? He shouldn't care about my magical power and you're suppressing yours, right? As much as I can, and using E.N.D's overwhelming power to mask what little is visible. He shouldn't have noticed us, unless..." Ziref's eyes flickered towards the Book of END before he turned them back to focus on Acknowledge. "We're moving," he stated, leaving no room for discussion with his tone before his eyes widened and he took a step towards her, reaching out for her shoulder. The second his grip tightened around it, he flung her backwards, throwing her into his shadow much to her surprise. He wasn't a moment too late when Acknowledge's claws sank into the ground where she, and the Book of END, had been. "Ziref," Acknowledge growled out, the words muffled to Levi from her position in the shadow. "So this is where you were hiding. Took you less time than I thought," Ziref muttered back in response, crossing his arms in front of his chest. "Worked it out, did you?" "I did," Acknowledge growled out, his gaze shifting towards the shadow Levi was stuck in. "Let her out. She's got something I want." "I'd rather not do that." "That wasn't a request." Acknowledge closed the gap before Ziref had time to blink, ripping out the Dark Mage's throat and retreating back before the death field could expand out in retaliation. "It was an order. And you think I'll listen?" Ziref asked, raising a hand and rubbing where the wound would have been. "You attacks hurt a lot more than I remember, but it means pretty little if you can't kill me." Acknowledge stared at him coldly for a moment before a smirk appeared on his face as he rose his hand, magic gathering around it and extending upwards out until a beam of pure energy was being held in his hand, stretching up towards the sky. "I know how that magic of yours works. It's quite an annoying piece of magic, but she won't move from your shadow alone. In other words, she's still here. And... well, there's two options really. I understand very well how immortal you are, but it doesn't stop you from being erased for a moment. I don't need death to stick. I just need that connection to break for a moment. Destroying your body entirely should do it." Ziref took a step back, trying to sink into the shadows himself, but Acknowledge was faster. Ziref had only managed to sink a third of the way into the shadow when Acknowledge continued his swing down, the long beam of energy that he had made connecting with the ground. Then for Ziref, nothing existed for a moment. For Levi, she saw it all. How one moment there had been land, and the next everything in a long line, further than the eye could see, was gone. That kind of power. She had known Acknowledge was dangerous. She had seen it from a distance. But this wasn't a monster. This was something far worse. And it terrified her. "Oh, there you are." And she wasn't in the shadow either, she realized immediately. Words sprung to her air, as many as she could create in that instant, but in the face of Acknowledge it was nothing. He proved that by catching one of her hands in her attempts and breaking her wrist as he threw her away. "And here at E.N.D, Acknowledge muttered, looking down at the book lying at his feet. It looked so innocent. So harmless. He didn't hesitate in raising a foot and preparing to crush it under his heel. In one swift move, ignoring Levi's attempts of retaliation, he brought his foot down and smashed it onto the ground, no book in sight. Growling in frustration, Acknowledge glanced away from the point that the book had sank into and turned towards where Ziraf had, and now did, stand. You are trying my patience. And you are trying mine. Funny, seeing as you're the one who tried to kill me in the first place. What can I say? Ziraf said with a shrug. You became too much trouble to keep around. The dragons were a pain, but your one-sided obsession was becoming difficult to handle. You were becoming too difficult to handle. If it wasn't me, another Ukin would have done it in my place. And yet they haven't tried since that hybrid did, Acknowledge snarled. And you know why? You have an Ukin down there with Dragon Slayer magic and I'm still winning. I'm not just strong. I'm the strongest. As to prove his point, Acknowledger raised his claws and stabbed them into the shadow at his feet. A pointless endeavor. What does a show of force like that? Ziraf's words trailed off at the sight of the shadows being peeled away, the form of the Book of End becoming visible. Acting instantly, he shot forward, remembering just in time to pull Levi into the shadows as he passed before expanding his death field at full force. It was enough to make Acknowledge leap away, his job half done, and in that moment Ziraf didn't hesitate to lunge for the Book of End and pull it tightly against his chest. With his death field fading, he quickly threw himself towards the nearest shadow before pushing the book in first. It was the right move, he realized when he felt a set of claws stab straight through his chest, coming out the other side and hitting where the Book of End had just been. He was already going off the seconds in his head as Acknowledger roared in frustration, only half away of the words he was saying to taunt the dragon into wasting time. Just a second more and Acknowledger realized what he was up to at the last moment, his claws being pulled out and fleeing just as his death field expanded once again. He wasn't disappointed with that, Acknowledger would never have forgotten the need to move. He had just forgotten that there was time in between, and that was all he needed to finish the job and throw himself into the same shadow that the Book of End was in. Entering the shadows made everything slow down. He knew his goal, he knew who he needed to take, and now he just had to get them somewhere far away from here. Once he had that, he moved through the shadows at will, making sure to pull Levi with him. When they finally left the shadows, barely a second had passed and Acknowledge was a mere speck in the distance. Well, Ziraf muttered, ignoring Levi's attempts to calm herself as she clutched her chest fearfully. That could have gone better. The others are fighting that. She muttered in terror. How much has Acknowledge been holding back if he could make an attack that destructive? A lot, Ziraf muttered. I wasn't aware he was capable of disrupting my magic in such a way. I guess that was the other option he talked about. His arrogance was a blessing earlier, he's been fighting the others with purely physical strength for the most part, but if that show of strength meant anything, it means he might be finally deciding to use his magical power properly now that End has provoked him enough. I thought End was meant to be our trump card. Seeing what we've seen so far, I hardly think that's the case anymore. No, we still have a chance, Ziraf muttered, double-checking his magical power was suppressed once again to prevent any way for Acknowledge to track them both down easily. After a quick warning to Levi to do the same, knowing that Acknowledge would have sensed her own and might now be actively searching for it, he continued explaining. In the grand scheme of things, beating Acknowledge outright has never been possible for us. Our numbers are too small and Acknowledge's might too strong. That's why killing Acknowledge is so important rather than matching him. At the very least I can confirm End has given us hope, Ziraf continued confidently. That is why Acknowledge came after us so forcefully, desperate to destroy the source of E.N.D's powers. End may not have the same level of power, but his curse ignores that same power. No matter how powerful Acknowledge gets, it doesn't change the fact that those flames hurt and will burn him. Except Acknowledge can kill Natsu, Levi shot back, still determined to use her friend's name rather than the name Ziraf had taken to calling him. He'll just crush him with attacks like that and make it take longer to heal him back up. How did Acknowledge even find us anyway? A flaw in the plan that I foolishly overlooked, Ziraf admittedly unhappily. Using the Book of End as we are is the right move. But I forgot that Acknowledge might be able to sense, and as a result follow, the link back to its source. If it took him till now to do it, my best assumption is that E.N.D's power is so strong that it hides the connection beneath it. But if he dies, it becomes exposed. And if it is exposed for long enough, Acknowledge can track us down, Levy realized in horror. He'll do the same thing again, and next time we won't get a chance to run. Next time he'll probably just tear apart everything in our general direction before we realize what's happening and hope it gets us. Zeref paused for a moment, his eyes widening in realization before a smirk appeared on his face. Oh, this could actually prove helpful. What, getting hunted by Acknowledge? Yes, Zeref admittedly readily. Keep doing what you were doing. Focus entirely on keeping the Book of END in top condition. After a showing like that, I'm sure the other Dragon Slayers will be on the move, having had time to recover, and this will give Acknowledge less time to chase us. I'll deal with that if the time comes. You do your job, and I'll do mine to keep you alive. You're insane to be this calm, Levy muttered, taking the Book of END from Zeref when offered it and setting herself down into a sitting position. Well, it's not like we can really run away now. Please just don't get me killed doing this. I hopefully won't, Zeref muttered, taking a stance in front of her and setting his gaze on Acknowledge in the distance, ready to watch his every move and look for any signs of aggression towards them. But if things go as I hope they will, everything should work out fine. You're lying, aren't you? Yes. Yes, I am. Protector of the fairies. The world fights back. You seeing that? I'm feeling that, muttered Sting. Has the ground still shaking or is it just me? Laxus glanced down at his left arm briefly, noticing how he couldn't quite keep it still. Nope, he muttered in response. I'm pretty scared too. Remind me never to face Natsu in this state. You're worried about Natsu right now? Sting asked in disbelief. I'm more terrified of what Acknowledge just did. I suppose it is a bit intimidating dash. A bit my ass. Look at what he did, Sting said, waving his arm out towards the direction Acknowledge had fired his attack in. See anything that way? No. Exactly. There was a mountain that way. A fucking mountain. And it's gone now. Gone in a single blow. What mountain even was that? I hope it wasn't an important one. It could have easily been a collection of rocks initially, God Serena stated from his position nearby, watching the clash between Acknowledge and END carefully. Irene's magic restructures everything caught in its grasp. She could have moved a mountain here or instead have built a new one from bits and pieces all across Fiori. Like that makes it any better. He still just destroyed it in one hit. Why aren't you more terrified of that? Because we were at least expecting that, stated Laxus. Acknowledge's display of force was intimidating. No, I'll even admit it was terrifying. But it's not outside the realm of what we expected. I didn't fucking expect that. Then you obviously didn't consider the full range of Acknowledge's strength, God Serena pointed out, ignoring Sting's rising temper as it was turned against him. That is your own fault. Mine. Gee, I'm sorry, I didn't expect him to be able to blow away everything in line for miles on end with a single spell. How could I have forgotten to account for that? Acknowledge has barely fought us so far with magic. He has been beating us in clash after clash with raw physical ability and some minor usage of magic here and there. Because that is all he needed to beat us in his mind. At least, that's what he was thinking. Even if the fight was dragged out a bit longer than he would want, he would still win. That is what the King of Dragons is thinking, or was thinking. END has changed that. Hence why I'm more scared of Natsu right now than Acknowledge, Laxus muttered, getting in between the two before they could provoke each other any further. I mean, look at him. He's pushed Acknowledge to this state, and considering the last time we saw him. You mean skewered on iron? I was thinking of a better way to say it, but yes. Last time we saw him, he died. It's safe to say that Zeref began interfering at that point and unleashed END, but I doubt END is like what any of us expected. You can say that again, Sting added, glancing over towards the remaining three of their group. Wendy was hard at work, trying to multitask, recovering her own strength and recovering Gajil's. Black and white light would surround her at regular intervals, and she would take in multiple large breaths when she had the chance to try and replenish her reserves through eating her natural element. But at the same time she had to also expend some of the energy she regained to try and heal the burns over Gajil's stomach. It had been worse when they first found him, like they had been going for some time. It was also why Toshiro was doing his best to help, freezing areas when necessary to help Wendy manage the burn piece by piece. They hadn't seen who did it, but there was only one culprit at a time like this. Natsu, or rather END. They had wondered what had happened to Gajil, and it was a good thing they had retreated back to regroup with E.N.D's appearance as a distraction for them. Without it they might have arrived too late to have been on after help to Gajil, as he certainly hadn't been able to help himself. He still hadn't regained consciousness yet, though Wendy looked hopefully it would happen soon. If it didn't, they'd have to press on with the assault without him. So, any of us got any bright ideas? Sting asked, turning his attention back towards Acknowledge. Toshiro's at full strength now, but Wendy's down for a bit. I can keep going for a good while longer, but I doubt Toshiro and I can handle that alone. How about you two? Laxus glanced down at his right arm. He could feel something. But it was still taking time to spread. Still trying to sync with him. I have something planned, but it's taking longer than I'd like. Even so, I'll throw in any strength I have, provided we can actually think of something that might work. I might be able to do something now, God Serena muttered. I've managed to bring 4 of my Dragon Slayer magic into sync with one another. Once I get close enough, I'll unleash it and launch a full blast of energy straight into Acknowledge. Provided I can get to him first. He's getting wary of surprise attacks after some of the last tricks we tried to pull. Good. Then let's try and get you close. And Laxus's head snapped towards the sound of groaning, falling silence, if only to help him confirm that his ears weren't playing tricks on him. What time is it? Gajil groaned, struggling to push himself up against Toshiro and Wendy's resistance. He glanced up at the lot of them, staring at them in confusion for a moment before they could see the gears slowly click into place. Ah. Natsu. He attacked Dash. Bit late to the party on that one, Sting said as he cut him off, rubbing the back of his head awkwardly at the confused look he was given. We've already seen him. And, well, we found the state you were in. Oh. Gajil glanced past them briefly, spotting the clash of figures in the far distance, before letting out a groan in annoyance. Ah, great. What else did I miss? Well, a mountain's gone, so that's something, Sting grumbled, gesturing towards the path Acknowledge's attack had gone. Plus everything close to it. A mountain? Acknowledge did that. Sting waved a hand towards Gajil as he spun to the others. See. That's the reaction, that's normal. Enough about that, Laxus said before Sting could try and push his point further. Gajil, we'll going on the attack again to try and back up Natsu, or rather END? Yeah, I doubt that's wise, Gajil said, waving away Wendy's attempts to continue healing him. Look, Shorty, I'm fine. Save your strength. Besides, you look tired yourself. I'm fine, Wendy protested before she was forced back by Gajil pushing her away by her head. Hey. I said I'm fine, Gajil repeated, groaning slightly as he clutched his stomach. All right, mostly fine. But this isn't going to be a problem for me. I can deal with a bit of pain. Save your energy for if you need to heal a collapsing lung or a broken leg or a wound that actual matters. You said you doubted that it's wise for us to jump in, Toshiro said from Gajil's side. Why? Why? Gajil gestured at himself reluctantly. Who do you think put me in this state? Natsu. No, that thing is END now. And END is not our friend. You know what he said as he slammed his fist into my gut. What? Ah, Gajil replied, trying to replicate the odd tone he had heard in Natsu's voice at that moment. I broke him. You understand what that means, right? He attacked me and got upset when I didn't get back up, and it sounded like a child getting upset that they broke something playing too rough. Because to END, I doubt we are seen as anything but toys or playthings. If we step into that battle, there's the same chance that he'll attack us as he will Acknowledge. Wendy slowly raised a hand, catching their attention nervously. Couldn't we just play with him? Play with the demon? God Serena let out a laugh for a few moments, uncaring at how Wendy seemed to retreat back into herself, before he stopped abruptly. I take it back, actual. The idea has merit. It's risky, muttered Toshiro. It involves hoping END won't just attack us on the spot. It's the best chance we have to work alongside him. Wendy, you're a kid. You think he'll listen? I think so. God Serena groaned into his hands. This is your idea. At least be more confident in it if you are going to suggest it. What were you like at that age? I'd probably go running for the nearest adult, Wendy admitted. You'd all be scary to my younger self. Alright then. Assume you were a kid who only wants to play, and apparently doesn't care with who he plays with. Would you let people join in? Wendy glanced briefly towards END in the distance before slowly nodding. I think so. If END is thinking like a child, he might be able to be reasoned with when it comes to simple stuff like this. Can't guarantee he'll listen to us at all. He won't, Laxus stated. Knowing what Natsu when he was young was like in the guild, I doubt END will be manageable at all. But so long as he's not actively attacking us, we'll be fine. Just make sure to watch out for any of his attacks. He probably won't care if he attacks us in the process as hitting Acknowledge. Protector of the Fairies. This team was an odd one. He couldn't say he had the greatest experience in working with others. As a member of the Spriggan 12, and even before then as a member of the Four Gods of Ishgard, he had never really been much of a team player. Working together in a fight to him meant everyone fighting and throwing all their strength around, uncaring if anyone else would get caught up in the blast. It was rare to ever encounter someone he, and those he had been with, couldn't crush with the simple tactic of raw force. And now here he was, outclassed by a mile and only having a chance to win if he actually learned what he had never bothered to before. A stage he had claimed his own now had to be shared, else he'd be booted off it and never step foot on it again. It was definitely a unusual feeling, he'd admit. The closest he had come to feeling something like this before was against the Celestial Spirit King, when he had August have worked in harmony to hold him off. But it was different this time. He could have held off the Celestial Spirit King alone until Zeref put his plan into action, he was sure of it. Here, his strength couldn't even be fully utilized without the others. He couldn't shine without allowing another to steal the spotlight momentarily, and sometimes he even had to accept it being taken away when he became the light that hid them instead. It would have bothered him once. It probably would once this fight was done. But for the time being, he didn't quite mind this feeling. Which was why he was able to stay so calm as he was carried across the sky with the others, the charge led by the massive form of the rebuilt iron dragon armor of Gajeel. His position on its neck, clinging onto a small indent he had made in the metal, let him see Acknowledge clearly as they approached, along with the response they got for daring to charge at him like this. Swung almost lazily, Acknowledge waved a hand towards them, his claws tracing across the sky. It would have been a dismissive action normally, one not to worry about. Here, the magic being swung at them made it a massive threat. 4 large piles of energy, shaped into arcs, tore across the sky towards him, with what he reckoned was enough strength to at least take out a good chunk of the iron dragon Gajeel was flying within and clip its wings. Should he go and block them? With the power currently under his skin, begging to be set loose, he knew he could do it. It would be easy. But easy wasn't good. If he could do it easily, he would shine brighter than anyone else here. And then Acknowledge would notice him and tear out his throat if he got given the chance. For once, he had to sit back and watch. It was for that same reason that he clung to the dragon tighter, unable to use his own magic currently without giving away the surprise he had for Acknowledge. At least those he shared the stage with were competent enough to shine without any assistance from him, even if it wasn't as majestic. Toshiro leapt off from the top of the dragon's head, easily outpacing it and raising a hand towards the 4 attacks. With a mere thought, ice formed from his palm and spread outwards in the blink of an eye, forming a massive defensive barrier in the face of the attacks. He could hear the sound of the attacks slamming into it, the giant wall cracking, but it refused to break. Best of luck. He heard called out as 2 voices quickly trailed off, his eyes flickering to the source just in time to watch Wendy and Sting leap from the dragon and drop downwards towards where flames still were lit. How long would it take them to get END, he wondered. Hopefully it wouldn't be long. Gripping onto the dragon as tight as he could as he felt their speed increasing, he turned back towards the front only to find Gajeel taking them at full speed straight into the wall. At this pace they'd crash straight into it and likely right into the line of fire of Acknowledge. It would be better to destroy the world right now and give them some visible first before charging in like this and... His doubts diminished when the ice shattered of its own accord just before they slammed straight into it, Toshiro dropping down onto the dragon's head and gripping onto it tightly as they rammed straight through falling shards of ice. He felt something sliced through the air close to them, glancing back just in time to see similar slices of energy from before cutting through the air where they had been. He was sure that would have hit them if they had merely rammed through the solid ice wall, their speed lost from the collision. So maybe this lot did know what they were doing, or at least had enough faith to trust in one another for such reckless plans. You want to fight like a dragon again? Then a dragon you will get. Acknowledge roared, his form shifting as he turned to his dragon form once more and sped straight after them. He almost lost his grip when Gajeel suddenly span them around, pulling his form up and bringing one massively armed iron arm back. What looked like claws at the end appeared to have been sharpened as much as they could have been, and he wondered for a moment if they might be able to piece Acknowledge's scales like this. He got his answer when Acknowledge swung a massive fist of his own at them, having the blow caught by Gajeel's own. The metal cracked, it bent, but at the same time the claws managed to dig into Acknowledge's own flesh. The wounds were minor but he could see blood, however slight it was. And apparently so could Acknowledge if the deafening roar it let out in fury was any indication. Quickly trying to take advantage of the situation, he saw Gajeel stab forward with his other arm. Acknowledge was still fast, even in this massive form, and dodged the claws with them only glancing off his scales, scratching them but not breaking through this time. It seemed it wouldn't take anything more than a direct hit going for such armored areas. He didn't have much time to consider such things though when Acknowledge swung down with his other arm and tore off the arm that had holding his other hand in place. A repeat of before flashed through his mind as Gajeel tried to back away, the arm he had lost being brought back to be thrown at him, when at the last second a mass of lightning struck Acknowledge dead on as he was about to throw. The result had the arm going off course from its intended target but it didn't fly far, its form halting as lightning sparked around it mid-air before being dragged back towards them at alarming speeds, slamming straight into the side it had been in as the metal began to intertwine with one another. He could see the fading lightning on where the arm had been ripped from, knowing it was the work of Laxus and not Gajeel himself. He must have drawn it back in a similar way to what he did with his own arm, using lightning as a link, though he wondered how he was doing it currently. He got a good idea when he saw lightning begin to spark around that same arm. He guessed they were lucky it was the right arm that Acknowledge had torn off and not the left. He doubted the same could have worked. That explained why he had seen the man give Gajeel his right arm earlier and had whispered something to him. And why Gajeel had seemed so amused right afterwards. Still, it wouldn't take long for Acknowledge to realize the trick. But until he did, he was probably actively looking for Laxus first. That lightning had come from somewhere, and Laxus wasn't anywhere in sight. Without warning, Acknowledge suddenly rushed them, letting out a deafening roar in challenge. Reacting quickly, he saw Gajeel swing out at him, metal flying forth as shards from his arm, only for their vision to be blinded by an immense amount of smoke that covered Acknowledge entirely. He knew what had happened. But just because he knew, it didn't mean they could do anything about it. Gajeel's arm swung through empty space, parting the smoke, and then Acknowledge and his human form slipped right beneath it and grabbed the iron dragon by the teeth, one hand on each set. The second Acknowledge managed to force the iron dragon's jaws open however, even if he had expected the one hiding within, he wasn't ready for the attack that slammed straight into it. From his perspective, it looked like the iron dragon had suddenly released a blast of electricity like a normal breath attack for them, Acknowledge being forced back across the air as Laxus pushed forward with his remaining fist. That advantage didn't last long though. That fist was still flesh and blood, not nearly as powerful as his right arm, and as he tried to retreat back he was caught by his leg and swing back at them. The metal dented as Laxus slammed into the dragon's chest, Laxus trapped there for a moment while Acknowledge closed the distance once more. Gajeel swung a fist once more, but this time Acknowledge didn't bother avoiding it, instead reaching out and stopping it with one arm. Before Gajeel could pull it back, Acknowledge had grabbed it, swung them around before throwing them straight down towards the ground. Acknowledge's head immediately came back and he knew what the dragon planned to do. A breath attack, even a weak one, from him would destroy this armor entirely. He'd have to move now. Or at least that was the plan if they had flown down any further. He had been about to leap off when suddenly a blur had shot past them, the temperature rising drastically, before their momentum was suddenly reversed as End grabbed a hold of the Iron Dragon's tail and used all his built-up force to swing them back up. He hadn't expected it. But neither had Acknowledge. The dragon didn't even have time to react when a massive ton of iron in the form of a dragon slammed straight into him, forcing a half-prepared breath attack to be released up into the atmosphere, parting the clouds from the shockwave. In that moment, as their form began to carry past Acknowledge as the dragon slipped beneath them, he saw Toshiro make his move, leaping off the dragon once more and freezing the space beneath Acknowledge. The dragon slammed into it harshly, and he could see the dragon getting annoyed and raising an arm to smash the ice to pieces, even as it tried to creep up his own body and slow his movements. That was his chance, right there. Without thinking about it any further, he let himself drop. He couldn't afford to use magic, not yet, so he let gravity do the work for him. He wondered if Acknowledge even sensed his approach. Probably, but then the dragon might not be seeing him as the biggest threat currently, likely to respond with only the minimum amount of force required. Well, that was fine with him. Acknowledge could think that. Right up until the last moment. Only a few meters away, he finally unleashed his magic once more, releasing a breath he hadn't been sure how long he had been holding it for. 4 forms of Dragon Slayer magic burst to life inside him, resonating perfectly with one another and producing something far greater than their separate selves. If he could have seen himself, he was sure he would have seen the sclera of his eyes turning pitch black while the irises shrank, becoming like pinpricks and turning completely white. The sensation in this form was never one had ever fully gotten used to. He didn't know what it was like for other hybrids, but his state came about from actual elemental forms of magic, one of the hardest routes to reach what he was. But because of it he had a better understanding of a lot more of the world like this. Where others became power incarnate, he became more like a force of nature. With a flick of his wrist, magic burst to life in his palm. At first it was like a spark, and within a second it had grown until it encompassed his entire hand. By the time he had closed that last small gap between Acknowledge, it now was the size of a small house, every bit of energy within it condensed down as much as possible. Acknowledge was fast, recognizing the new danger, but even he couldn't avoid this at such a distance. Toshiro had made sure of that, the ice he had made not only slowing Acknowledge down but also blocking off an entire plane of direction for Acknowledge to flee in. As his attack hit, he realized something. It had definitely been worth waiting. He had never shone so brightly before. The ice cracked before shattering entirely, the massive ball of energy being carried downwards without any further assistance from him. It continued all the way to the ground, pressing Acknowledge down into it before finally every last drop of that energy was released in a massive explosion. "Hey! Don't break my toy." "I didn't break him," he muttered, not even sparing a glance towards where End was hovering in the air with his flames. "If that alone could do it, I'd have fought Acknowledge alone years ago. Everyone, keep up the assault." Kicking off the air, he shot straight downwards, magic running through his body at alarming rates as he pushed every part of him to its utmost limit. The ground, or what was left of the old surface, cracked when he landed, and shattered further when he used it as a springboard to leap away from Acknowledge's first strike of retaliation. Taking a leaf out of the Shinigami and Quincy's books, he brought his newly united energy and hardened it beneath his feet as he released it, creating a platform for a brief moment before kicking right off it again, his fist slamming straight into Acknowledge. He couldn't get away in time to avoid Acknowledge's retaliation, one arm coming up and taking the hit from Acknowledge as the dragon's fist slammed into him, but he had more than enough time to dart back and avoid the second. His arm felt bad though. His durability had increased, but it had merely prevented it from being broken, and instead now he was sure the bones were merely cracked instead. Repeated hits would break it, and that was if it was taking punches alone. Acknowledge's claws were still just as dangerous, as was his magic. The best option then would be to prevent the latter being used. Pushing himself as fast as he could, he darted at Acknowledge, raining down blow after blow and unleashing magic with each strike. Individually he was sure they weren't doing much, but they did push the dragon back, not giving him a chance to react. With a final punch, he packed even more energy into his fist and sent the dragon soaring backwards. He'd bought himself time, during which he wasted no time in bringing both arms upwards and prey towards the sky. Energy pooled around him, what he had lost already being replenished quickly from his surroundings and funneled directly into this spell. Slowly bringing his hands apart, energy spread out and formed orb surrounding him, the energy of each spiraling around within and trying to remain stable without unleashing its deadly payload. He wouldn't have enough time for this normally. Acknowledge would be fast to recover. But as the dragon prepared to go after him, enough ice to build a mountain slammed down on top of him. He would have laughed if he had the time, but with the sound he could hear, like a muffled roar, he knew the ice wasn't going to hold Acknowledge for long. Lightning tore down from the sky en masse just as Acknowledge began to tear his way out, slamming straight into the dragon. It barely slowed him down, but END was there during that brief opening, a wide smile across his face as he spun round with his arms on fire. Fire of the worst kind slammed into Acknowledge, but it was also heading straight for him too. If he wanted to avoid it, he'd have to abandon his spell. In the end, the choice wasn't one he had to make. The massive form of Gajiel's iron dragon slammed into the ground in front of him, the flames slamming against his side before he kicked back off the ground before he was forced to slam into him. "Do it!" He heard Gajiel roar out as the giant iron dragon sailed over his head. He let a smirk cross his face as his arms fully extended out to the side, hundreds of orbs hovering in the air all around him. "Go on. Crush him!" He roared sadistically, swinging his arms forward and slamming his palms together. Every single orb shot forward at once, the energy being unleashed in a rain of magic that was aimed squarely at Acknowledge himself. END would be caught in the blast radius, but there was little he could do to prevent that. At least END would be regenerated thanks to Zeref's interference though. That he could at least count on, and if it made Acknowledge hurt then it was a worthwhile trade. His smirk only grew as the energy exploded against Acknowledge, any excess energy released being blown past the dragon and leaving nothing in its wake. He kept up the attack for as long as he could, until eventually he felt it actually becoming draining. He doubted he had ever produced so many simultaneous attacks at once, nor fueled each with as much magic as he had done. "Are you done?" And then the smirk dropped from his face as the smoke cleared, and Acknowledge was revealed with one arm held up towards them. The scales were destroyed in dozens of areas, a sign of how powerful his attack had been, but he was sure it should have done more. Acknowledge had decided to use magic to block it, hadn't he? He could see the remainder of whatever spell or form he had shaped it into still lingering around his arm. But what was more worrying was all the energy packed into his other arm. "Your spell is similar to one of my own. Should I show you how it should really be used?" Merely by the action of Acknowledge raising his hand, he realized what the dragon was about to do far before the sky began to shine, pockets of light forming in every area of free space above Acknowledge. "Perish under my might." He hadn't had time to react when every single one of those lights, too numerous to try and count, released more magic than 10 of his own attacks combined. They weren't being aimed, but judging by power alone, they didn't need to be. They'd leave nowhere to run merely by carpet bombing the entire battlefield. Spells quickly burst to life in his mind, ideas trying to quickly form to get out of this one. But in the end, none came fast enough. This entire place was about to vanish under all that magic. And then before it did, he felt the ground shake and shift beneath his feet, almost as struggling against some invisible force. "Ah crap," he muttered, bringing up as magic as he could quickly and wrapping it around himself in a shield, praying it would be enough. And then the ground beneath his feet shifted and reverted to what it once was. Protector of the Fairies. She could still sense Acknowledge. How much time had passed so far? A few minutes? A few hours? To her, it felt like days. It was difficult to keep track of time in her current condition. Sometimes the minutes felt like they were being stretched out until she couldn't tell how much time had passed at all. Other times it felt like so much had happened in an instant, her consciousness flickering in and out of focus. The pain she felt made it all worse though. Since the world had shifted, she had encased herself in stone, pressing it tightly against her large form and preventing herself from moving. It was the only reason she was still breathing right now, since she couldn't aggravate her injuries any further. Not that it was going to help save her in the end. She was still bleeding. Blood still managed to slide across her body through small gaps between the stone and her skin, and she could feel the small pool she was lying in growing bigger every time she managed to pull herself back from slipping into unconsciousness. It wasn't easy. Even now she felt weak, and each time it was harder and harder to keep herself awake and aware. The greatest help for that was, ironically, Acknowledge. He was the one who had put her in such a state, but now he was the one keeping her clinging to life. Every time a massive blast of magic was released, she picked it up from her senses. They would help her snap her mind back into place, to give it something to focus on, and even then sometimes it wasn't always enough to manage it quickly. Except in cases when Acknowledge himself did something. She wished she knew how the battle was unfolding. Magical power fluctuated heavily, and too many of them were unfamiliar to her. Were they winning right now? How did Acknowledge look? Had they dealt him a fatal blow yet? Or at least one that would weaken him? How were the others doing too? Had August managed to make it to his destination yet? She hoped he would. She wasn't sure how long she could hold her magic in place in her current condition. The original plan had been for her to not undo the magic until much later, but that wasn't a possibility anymore. How was Emperor Spriggan doing too? She had noticed he didn't seem to be where he used to be in her senses. Had he moved at some point? And if so, why? Had Acknowledge found him and forced him to run? Such an act was unforgivable, and as one of his shields she should be out there getting retribution for him. But she couldn't. Even if she could, she would likely end up dead, considering the power that had almost killed her in one strike. All she could do right now was try and maintain her magic. But for how long? Casting the spell had been the hard but the most draining on her reserves, but maintaining it was an easy job. At her peak she had enough power to maintain this spell for a few days, and with what she had left she was sure she could manage a few hours easily. Magically, she wouldn't fail. But physically? That was what she feared. Her body was giving up. It would give up long before her magic ran out, no matter how long she tried to put off the inevitable through force of will. Soon, whether it be in a few minutes or a few hours, she would die. And when she died, her magic would end. She had to try and hold on. Just a bit longer. That was the way to think. Not an hour, not a minute. But a second. Again, and again, and again. She had to never stop believing in that, and move from one moment to the next. So long as she could keep this spell going, she could keep the playing field as they want. This was her life's work, all for the sole purpose of slaying the one whose very existence had brought her nothing but tragedy, and she couldn't let it end yet. Acknowledge had to pay for everything he had done. Even if she couldn't deal the blows herself, she could take pride in each hit that landed on him because of her actions. Each hit would be retaliation to him for what his actions caused. For the fear it put in those that fought alongside dragon slayers, who saw people like her as the next monsters like him. For the pain she had to endure as her friends were slaughtered and her lover abandoned her, her fate only altered not from sympathy but because she had begun to change enough so that their blades couldn't pierce her scales. And finally for the pain she had to endure from losing her form entirely. If she had been given time, she might have been able to prevent it. She might have been able to find a cure. She could have lived a normal life. Could have loved her daughter rather than abandoning her at the doorway of a church in some distant village. Yes. If only such a being like Acknowledge had never existed. The dragons and their war had been a major source of conflict, one that brought rise to them as dragon slayers, but no one had truly begun to fear them as monsters until Acknowledge became one. If only he hadn't become so good at killing. Things from the past couldn't change, as much as she wished they could, and now they were nothing more than regrets driving her forward. Keeping her desperately trying to stay awake. But it was so hard. Her focus wavered even now, losing track of Acknowledge and the others for a few moments. She had to hang on. Just a bit longer. Another second or two, again and again, and again, for as long as it would take. She could do it. She was one of Spriggan's shields. An unbreakable one. And that wasn't going to change now. Not yet. Never. All she had to do was stay awake. And keep her eyes open. Keep her mind focused, and activate. She had to. The eyes of Irene struggled for a few more moments, life desperately trying to stay in them, before even that died. And as the last breath left the dragon trapped beneath the earth, the world snapped back into place. Protector of the Fairies. What's the status? Juoshiro asked, gripping the nearest chair as support as he pulled himself to his feet. Report. Unknown, sir, Doran Bolt replied to him, looking equally as shaken. Hastily getting to his feet, he rushed to the door before glancing out, looking down each side of the corridor and confirming that it was back to normal. But I think the magic you sensed wore off. Good, Juoshiro muttered, pulling himself into the chair before raising a hand to the air in front of him and swiping out. He frowned however when nothing happened, repeating the action more slowly this time and only getting a flicker of a screen in response. Sir. I'm fine, Juoshiro muttered weakly, repeating the process a few more times before the screen finally manifested properly. Must be interference, he added uncertainly. Or maybe I'm just getting weaker. My illness has been acting up more lately. You should rest, Doran Bolt stressed, rushing to Juoshiro's side until the man waved his attempts of help away. Sir. I'll be fine, Juoshiro answered him. I'm just not as strong as I used to be. That's all. Glancing at the screen before him, he quickly noticed the message that appeared before him before letting out a long sigh of disappointment. So the battle is still ongoing. Acknowledge has yet to fall. You have an agent on the ground. Yes, and judging by this message it appears Acknowledge is still alive. Worse, getting this message means he's winning. Which means now we have to resort to the worst case scenario. Is that wise, sir? Doran Bolt asked, glancing away nervously when Juoshiro turned his attention towards him. Acknowledge is a threat, but this? How far will the blast radius stretch out? Will it reach our own men? How many will we inadvertently kill to destroy Acknowledge? Too many, was the answer he got back. It wasn't one he wanted, but when he glanced back to meet Juoshiro's eyes he saw nothing but regret in them. This decision, it's like many I have had to make, though on a far larger scale. To do what is correct, or to do what is right. Unfortunately my position gives me little room to decide things based on my own conscience. I have to make the hard decision, even if it's one I will struggle to live with afterwards. What about the others? Should we inform the Queen? We don't have time, Juoshiro admitted. I will take full responsibility. This is why I had made preparations for this in the first place. Looking back at the screen, he sighed once again before his hand began to hover over the button that would send the final signal necessary. I pray to the sacred light that I'll find forgiveness for this, for no god would grant it to me otherwise. Release. Etherian. Protector of the Fairies. The dwindling of hope. Wendy? 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 Wendy's eyes snapped open at the sound of a familiar voice, the face of her grandfather hovering above her worriedly. Nabera? She asked tiredly, rubbing her eyes as she forced herself to sit up. Looking around, she had to frown for a moment at the unfamiliar landscape, having no idea where she even was. Where? It all flooded back to her, and immediately the look of confusion made way for one of dread. Suddenly she had no interest in where she was and was instead looking around as fast as she could, desperate to see any familiar face. Still, in her fear she hadn't actually expected to see one. That's Natsu, right? Nabera nodded beside her, looking worriedly at the demon who was pacing back and forth across the ground, the look of pure confusion on the demon's face. Yes. He hasn't noticed you yet, luckily. If he had, well, it's best to move quickly before he does notice. Wendy shook her head, taking her eyes off Natsu to look around for anyone else. Is it just us? Where is everyone else? I'm not sure, Nabera admitted. They might be back where we were. It appears the magic of that woman's finally ran its course. And threw me here, Wendy muttered. This isn't Tenro though. No, it isn't. It's likely this is merely where the piece of land you were near had come from, and since Natsu was close to you he was brought along for the ride. We can't be too far then, stated Wendy, feeling more confident than before. I wasn't out for long, was I? Only a minute or two. But if both you and Natsu remain missing for too long and Acknowledge manages to reach the others. Wendy nodded, resting a hand over the familiar form of the lacrima in her chest. I know. But if I'm careful. I don't think I'm as far this time, so maybe I'll be able to lock onto the others properly. I just need to dash. She froze as a hand grabbed her from behind, flames being held in front of her face with the heat batting against her eyes. You can take me back? A voice asked, and for a second she had to remember who it was that was speaking. Even though it was Natsu, the childish tone he took and his entire attitude continued to throw her off. Back to my toys. Yes. She managed to struggle to say, not daring to move her head when Natsu could just as easily move his hand by accident and burn her skin away. I can get us back. So you can, keep playing. She hadn't been sure if such words would have worked, but she knew they had when she was released from behind. Blinking away tears, she spared a glance round only to come to face with Natsu, a massive smile across his face. For a moment she even thought it was the Natsu she knew. Yay. Come on, let's go. I want to play more with that dragon's ear. F got me. And then words like that shattered any similarities they might have shared. As happy as Natsu might have normally looked back at the guild, he had never acted like this. Closing her eyes, both to focus on the task at hand and to avoid looking at Natsu any longer, she did her best to try and focus on their destination. They shouldn't be far, hopefully, so if she could just pick up where the others were. Except she couldn't, she realized. Wherever the others were, they were far beyond the range of her senses. No, she couldn't panic just yet. She just had to try and work step by step and locate them, otherwise this would be Tenro all over again. She just had to focus. To the north, there were some readings she could barely sense, but they seemed too weak to be any of her friends. She certainly didn't recognize them. A bit east. Her eyes snapped open as she found herself lifted from the ground, pain unlike any other exploding forth across her body as Natsu clasped a flame-coated hand around her throat and pulled her up to his level. Hurry up! Natsu exclaimed impatiently, his frown only deepening as she began to scream from the pain. She couldn't help it. Her magic wasn't helping in the slightest, and she could feel the flames burning away her flesh. Whether Natsu had gotten tired of her screaming or was losing interest, she wasn't sure. All she knew was that she was suddenly hitting the floor, continuing to scream in pain as she began to roll around on the ground. It hurt. It hurt so much. Even after she managed to douse the flames with dirt and snuffed them out with now burnt hands, it didn't stop the pain. She couldn't breathe, no air seemed to enter her lungs as she tried, and could already begin to feel the effects of being starved of precious oxygen. But she couldn't stop it. She was going to die here, at the hands of her own friend, and there was nothing she could. I'm here, Wendy, a reassuring voice whispered to her, an ethereal hand landing on her shoulder. She tried her best to focus on the words, Nabara's voice trying to calm her, but it was no good. She was slipping further and further into the darkness that was swallowing her up. She could barely even make out the light shining in front of her, so familiar and yet so hard to place in her panicked state. And then the pain was gone. Well, not gone really. But dulled. She could feel it vanishing, diminishing piece by piece as the light began clearer to her eyes. Air entered her lungs as she gulped it down greedily, desperate for every last drop of it, afraid it would vanish if she didn't take full advantage of this chance. Shakily, one hand came up to her neck, the one that had been burnt away until it had destroyed her throat, and could feel the sensation of things brushing against it, of the flesh being pushed past her fingers and refitted back into place. Only when the last of it seemed to come to rest, when her neck felt the same as it always was, did the light begin to dim. Are you all right, Wendy? Nabara asked her in concern. All she could do was nod her head, afraid her voice would break and reveal just how scared she had just been. She had been about to die. And then Nabara had stopped that by repairing her body to its previous state. She could feel just how much magic that had drained from her, knowing that he must have put her throat back together piece by piece, even if it meant drawing in all the scattered pieces that had been burnt away by Natsu's flames. It didn't make the sensation any less terrifying to experience though. The last time this had happened, she had been so far gone that she hadn't been aware of anything until her eyes had opened to find herself fully healed, like none of the wounds she had taken had ever been there. Actually being awake meanwhile, experiencing the sensation of flesh being slotted back into place like a jigsaw of 1,000 pieces, was unnerving. She almost jumped out of her skin thought when Natsu leaned down in front of her, staring directly into her eyes with childish excitement. "What was that? You didn't break." She didn't like that tone, nor the way he was looking at her. She had seen what his last toy had been. If Natsu turned his attention away from Acknowledge and onto her, "I'd be no fun," she found herself saying rapidly, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt she did. "I'll just get back up slowly. You'll get bored really quickly." "Really?" Natsu tilted his head at her for a moment, his brow scrunched up as he looked at her like he was trying to work out whether she was lying or not. She didn't dare breathe while he did, knowing her entire fate would be decided on whether or not a demon child would decide she would be too boring to play with. After what felt like an eternity, Natsu finally leaned away from her before crossing his legs and sitting down in front of her. "All right. I'll just play with the dragon then." And like that she remembered how to breathe again, her heart still beating so fast that it felt like it was trying to break its way out of her chest. "I am sure you'll have some more fun with him," she managed to stammer out, praying to all the magic around him that Natsu wouldn't suddenly change his mind. "I'll take you to him," she added on quickly. "Just let me focus please. I need to find him." "Find him? But he's that way isn't he?" Wendy froze as Natsu pointed off in a random direction, not even looking at where he was pointing. How? There was no way he should be able to know, right? She could sense something in that direction, but the distance was too great to even determine what it was. It could have been thousands of mages whose magical power merged into one at this distance, or it could have been a glimpse at Acknowledge's power. So how was Natsu so sure? "Can you sense Acknowledge?" Natsu tiled his head curiously. "No." He sounded confused. Like he didn't know. But why was he claiming Acknowledge was that way if he wasn't even sure? Unless, was she thinking about this all wrong? Natsu right now was like a child. She might be young herself, but she had grown up far faster mentally than she really should have done thanks to all the stuff she had been thrown into. But she did still remember how innocent she had once been, and at how clueless she could be at times. There was so much she didn't understand. But she had understood one thing. What she saw, the sight she had always been able to see since as long as she remembered, was something no one else saw. People could ask her how she did something, ask her how she knew, but the answer they wanted was never one she understood. She had come to the answer differently, and yet the route had made complete sense to her. To her, the answer had been simple, even if her understanding had been built around something hard to explain. Children were the same. Natsu somehow knew Acknowledge was in that direction, and yet he couldn't sense him going by his answer. So then how had he determined that? What had he realized that had led him to such a conclusion? "Can you sense Zeref?" It was the only answer that could explain it. She hoped she was right, but she still felt the dread when Natsu did nod excitedly. "Yeah. If we go to Zeref, I'm sure the dragon will be there too. I saw it attack him." At this he pouted, crossing his arms. "I thought the dragon was my toy. Why did Zeref start playing with him too? I would have shared if he had asked." She did her best to smile reassuringly, words being uttered to reassure Natsu that she was sure Zeref hadn't meant to interrupt his fun. It was all an act to help shield the fact that she was horrified at what she had heard. The fact he could sense Zeref like that, it meant the connection between them was so strong now that Natsu could sense Zeref even when such a great distance was put between them. Natsu before this battle hadn't ever been capable of that. If this kept up, could Natsu even resurface again? Or was this demon going to become all that was left? If Natsu was still in there, could her magic reach him? She had messed up once with Kelia, but she had managed in the end to use Nirvana to remove her obsession to Wywak. She knew she could reach into such aspects of a person's identity, so could she find Natsu again and switch his position with END? It could be done in a flash if she focused. Every second that passed was one he might be further and further suppressed, until not even Nirvana would let her find him again. She could remove END from the equation and bring back her friend in one fell swoop. But as she even considered summoning up the magic, she hesitated. The thoughts that crossed her mind were cruel, ones she hated herself for even thinking, but she couldn't deny their truth. Switching out Natsu for END would likely not work. It wouldn't remove END, and what if she couldn't reverse it afterwards and END became the dominant personality when the book closed? And even if she switched them now, would Natsu still be able to use E.N.D's power? Because without it, she wanted him back, but END was one of the only things still giving them a chance at winning. So instead, she pushed all those dark thoughts from her mind and tried to focus on instead bringing them back. The sooner the battle ended, the sooner she could try and save him. "Could you take my hand?" she asked calmly, waiting for a moment for Natsu to reply. When it became apparent that he wasn't going to, content to look at her in confusion, she elaborated with, "I need your help to take us to Zeref." "Oh. Okay." Those words were enough, it seemed, to make Natsu pull his full trust with her, clasping her hand tightly. She tried not to let the pain show. Even if he didn't realize it, his grip was strong. Strong enough that it would probably crush her hand if she gave him a reason to consider her as anything but helpful. "I'm going to use you to help find Zeref, okay?" She had to ask before doing this. Most wouldn't mind, but she couldn't take the risk of Natsu seeing her or her actions as a threat. When he gave her a quick nod, she began to focus her gaze on him, looking around for the small link that would undoubtedly be binding Zeref and Natsu together. It was extremely hard to see, she quickly realized, even to her eyes. It was like a dark thread, blending into the shadows at their feet as if it desired to stay out of sight. Considering Zeref's current actions, the fact his magic was acting in such a way didn't surprise her too much. And as Natsu had claimed, Zeref did appear to be in the direction he had pointed in going by the trail. The path was clear at least. Now came the trickier part. Tapping into a small amount of Nirvana's power, she felt the world shift further to her eyes and focused on keeping track of the energy that bound the demon to its master. She couldn't afford to break the connection, nor could she risk merely leaving it alone if she wanted to find Zeref. She just needed enough. Her other hand slowly reached out towards the strand, and for a moment she even managed to forget Natsu was there. Her fingers were like scalpels in her task, cutting away at a small fragment of the energy along a long path. She could pick the energy now, the points she was removing it from, and with a flick of her wrist the whole area she had cut away disappeared from the stream and appeared within her palm. It began to swirl quickly, trying to escape into the air, but Nirvana was too strong for it to resist its pull. Every time it tried to leave, she looked it back so it remained trapped. Her eyes trailed across every little piece of the energy, feeling its power and reading its path. It had arrived here from so very far away, so far she was hardly able to believe it, but with every second she could see the clearer picture. She knew where Zeref was. That was only half of the problem, however. Just because she knew where to go, it didn't mean she could get there. She had the coordinates, but she had only successfully switched places with something at a great distance once, and even then it was entirely by accident and driven by desperation. Well, she had the latter in spades at the very least. She just had to get it right this time. By how was she even able to move them that far? To her eyes it was still so far away, and she'd never. "Close your eyes, Wendy." Nabara's voice rang in her ears and she didn't hesitate to do so, his voice even silencing any fears she might have had about Natsu taking advantage of her helplessness. "Listen to my voice," Nabara continued to say. "Forget about what you see. Forget about what you sense. Just listen to my voice. Forget." But, wasn't that going to make things more difficult? How was she even going to find her way back if she couldn't remember where to go? "You need to forget," Nabara's voice rang out again. "Even with your sight, you are still human. You perceive the world in a way that is still so limiting, and even when enhanced by how I see the world you have still yet to fully grasp what it means to truly see." To truly see? What was he talking about? How far is Zeref to you? A few miles? A few dozen? A few hundred? Is he so far away that you can no longer reach him? Yes. There was no way about it. Zeref was beyond her normal reach. And that is why you are being limited. To me, he is just as far as he has always been. What? The power of nirvana allows one to reach for all things in the world. It doesn't matter how far they are, nor how close. Everything is within the user's grasp. You believe you cannot reach Zeref because he is too far when in reality he is as reachable now as he always was. You simply shackled yourself, unable to push past the boundary you put on yourself by considering the concept of distance as a barrier you had to overcome. It was true that nirvana tended to be more costly when it came to what she was doing more than where she was doing it from, and since she normally always used nirvana at close proximity to people, she would have been less likely to notice any kind of difference in her usage of magic. But if she thought back to when she had been transported away to Tenro Island, she hadn't used up nearly as much magical power as she would have expected if she had been in a more sane state of mind. Which meant, yes, you are beginning to understand. However, you still need time to change your way of thinking. So allow me to help guide you. As the magic of nirvana began to build around her, she could feel Nabara gaining a grip on the magic. She could still feel it under her control, but it was like someone else was taking the steering wheel for the magic at the same time. She was sure if he wanted to he could force his control over it, but instead all she felt were the gentle nudges that helped push her in the right direction. You have not changed in this world. You are still a piece that remains even as everything else moves past. Imagine the rest of the world spinning beneath you, leaving you behind. Imagine the trees parting around you. Imagine the plains beyond the forest. Imagine the mountains in the distance become tiny as you pass them. The world continues to spin, and yet you remain where you always were. She could feel it. The magic of nirvana was growing wilder, like there was almost an undercurrent of excitement to it. Past the armies, past the cities, past the towns, let everything flow past you. There is only one point in this world that you desire to reach. The world can continue to spin beneath you until that point, so for now just let it spin. Until you find the place you seek. She could. Unlike before, when Zeref had felt like he was so far out of her grasp, now he felt like she could reach out and touch him. Good. That's good. Now. She could feel Nabara's grip on the magic loosen until it vanished altogether. Go ahead and move. She reached out and suddenly stumbled forward, almost crashing into Natsu as she opened her eyes. Only to realize it wasn't Natsu she was looking at, but someone else with blue hair. Levi? She asked in confusion, looking around before her eyes began to shine with joy. I did it. It worked. You did indeed, said Zeref before Levi could say anything, and Wendy quickly found her excitement draining as she turned towards the dark mage and saw the look in his eyes. There was a glint of danger in them, his gaze freezing her in place. I was right. You truly are going to become very fearsome one day. Pulling up as much courage as she could, she tried to force Zeref's attention away from her with a single question. Where are the others? It worked, though maybe a little too well. Zeref's gaze immediately shifted off her, his attention being drawn to the large stretch of land that led down from their hiding spot. Slowly she forced herself to her feet, ignoring Levi's warnings, and gazed past the rocks to the sight below. She felt like she was going to be sick when she saw what Levi had tried to prevent her from seeing. Because down in that shattered area of land were all her friends, and they weren't getting up. So you found a way back, a voice spoke from above, her gaze snapping up towards the source as the others copied her actions. Standing there in the sky, with pieces of ice struck to his body and small cuts along his face where some scales were visible, was Acknowledge. Good. That saves me the time of hunting you down myself. Protector of the fairies. He shouldn't have been feeling like this. Not when he was winning. The moment that accursed dragon's magic had run its course, the entire world had shifted back to how it once was. Even he had found himself miles away, and he had been able to sense the magic he had unleashed raining down all across the country at random points. At that moment he hadn't cared if it had hit any one thought because he could still sense the same amount of dragons as before. None of those he wanted to kill had died. He had made it back to them in no time. It would have been a short journey even at a normal pace, and he had been going far faster than that. He had arrived back before the dragon slayers could begin to even try and regroup, and had not let them have the time to do so from that point onwards. The problem was that he was missing dragon slayers. He had noticed it almost immediately, how there were only 4 present when he arrived back. The demon End, the Ukin, and, the most annoying of them all, the unrelenting healer. He had a pretty good idea of what had occurred. Like himself, they had been flung away when the world shifted back to normal. The 4 present must have had the fortune of being thrown close to each other, or maybe they had been standing in original, unaffected land. Whatever the case was, the fact he was missing opponents had irritated him to no end. So to deal with his frustrations, he had done the one thing he could. He attacked. He destroyed. He did everything to bury those frustrations deep below the surface. It was an easy process to do, one he had practiced many times over his long life. The Shinigami tried to take the lead, and it was certainly true that his ice was powerful. How many ice dragons had he fought with freezing abilities this powerful? Perhaps 1 in total, and that monster had been one of the toughest fights he had ever had. It had been so hard to make progress when he had barely been able to push through the snowstorm that had pelted him from all sides, each drop of snow freezing where it landed. However, this Shinigami was a far cry from that dragon. While he made up the differences with superior physical attributes compared to the dragon of old, it wasn't enough. He was still faster, which made the issue a moot point. At the Shinigami's best, he could free him in place for around 2 seconds currently if he relied on only physical strength. If he brought out magic too, that time dropped significantly. Still, he had managed to underestimate him. He had been frozen a second longer than he had expected, slowing him down enough that the dragon slayer with magic so similar to his had actually managed to land a pretty solid blow. Unfortunately for that dragon slayer, however, it had also shattered the layers of ice, locking him in place. He hadn't wasted time in that chance. Before any of them could stop him, he had grabbed the dragon slayer by his head and slammed him against the ground. Resistance fell quickly after that, which left him free to release his grip and face the remaining 3. Retaliation had come swiftly against him. Lightning had slammed into him from his right side, but it merely ticked. He hadn't even considered it worthy of being a proper distraction, even though he had known its intention. The fact that the dragon of iron bearing down on him from above had been obvious to him even before the lightning was fired. With one hand being raised, he let the magic he had gather and shape around it, sharpening it like a deadly blade as he swung. In one swift move he split the dragon down from head to tail, 2 halves of a metal dragon slamming into the ground beside him. He knew better than to assume he had killed the dragon slayer within, though. His attack had been too flashy, too telegraphed, so there had been more than enough time to move a few steps to the side. He didn't even have to wait long to see the dragon slayer show himself, a shaky smirk being thrown at him as iron fired off from the husk of the dragon he had split in 2. Despite the huge quality of metal being flung at him though, it was still individually weak. Given time it might have begun to chip away at his scales, but then even the strongest of shields would being to dent if hit in the same place again and again repeatedly. The magic had quickly ended when he had closed the gap and stabbed his claws straight into the dragon slayer's stomach. He would admit though that he had been surprised at the response he had gotten in response. Even though he had obviously been in pain, the dragon slayer had shown the nerve to continue to smirk right back at him, gripping his arm with all his strength as he turned his whole body to iron. The time it took to break the solid grip on him was less than a second, but in that time the Shinigami had reached him, his sword swinging through the air. He couldn't completely dodge each strike, and quickly cuts were beginning to show on his body as he tried to the time to retaliate. He'd give it to the Shinigami, his blade was dangerous when he funneled the right amount of Dragon Slayer magic through it. But no matter how much of an advantage he had gained, it was still only brief. It only had taken one mistake, one misstep, one foolish attempt that left him overextended, and then the Shinigami had joined his 2 friends. The only difference was that he was making a lot more noise, clutching his wrist where his right hand previously been attached to. The noise had quickly began to grate on his nerves, but before he had made the Shinigami shut up he had been faced with the last of the 4. The foolish excuse for a human, that being unsure what he even was, had decided to try and keep him back. He even recognized the spell being flung at him at close range, the massive lance of lightning a deadly weapon against most. It was a shame he had already countered this spell once before. He had caught it in his palm, letting the lightning slam against it and falter. It was stronger than before, he'd admit that at least, but wasn't enough. It would never be enough. In one swift move, he had shattered the lightning and let the magic that made it explode out unstably. He didn't even wait for it to fade as he made his move, stepping through the storm and slamming his fist straight into the thing. He hadn't let up either. He could move far much faster, and he did. For every punch he threw, he moved even faster to chase down the Dragon Slayer and hit him from behind. He knew he could have already ended the battle. It had been reduced to a mere one-on-one, and he wouldn't lose in a battle like that. But he hadn't wanted it to end. Merely looking at the Dragon Slayer, he had been able to feel such anger. Eventually though, even that had begun to be tiring to him. He had caught the Dragon Slayer after the last of his many strikes and had slammed him straight against the ground. And then he had torn his arm off, but even then it hadn't been enough. So he took the other, and it still hadn't been enough. So he continued, tearing off his legs and then beginning to claw away at the Dragon Slayer's chest. He had thought it might have made him enjoy it more. It hadn't. He had felt the feeling of his claws hitting dragon flesh at times, and hitting human flesh at other. This state the Dragon Slayer was in was one that he hated to look at. It was like he hadn't been able to decide whether he was a dragon or a human and had decided to change half of his body. But the worst part was that he had been in this same situation himself once. It had gone by far faster if he remembered it correctly, but he still remembered it well. The bad memories always tended to be the strongest and easiest to remember. He believed he even still had the scars from when he had tried to claw out his own heart. He had never managed to. He wondered what a heart would look like if the Dragon Slayer was in this state. He knew he could go back to the Dragon Slayer now and rip it out if he was truly curious, but he hadn't been able to bring himself to do that. Even now he wondered why. Had he felt like he had done another already? Or did he just not want to know what his heart must have once looked like? Even now he knew that the four were still alive too. It would be easy to go and finish them off. He wanted, in fact. But what came after that? This fight. It had been the first thing in 400 years to truly make him feel alive again. Centuries of waiting, desperately hoping that the dragons would reappear again, and finally he was rewarded with that chance. Sure, he might have not picked them up immediately, but he was here now, finally finishing what he had started so long ago. Once they died, he would have killed every dragon left in the world. But once that fight ended, what would come next? He didn't know. It was even making him hesitate. What was there for him after this battle? What would his purpose be? Would he be subjected to an eternity without purpose? Would he be stuck in a static world, with no excitement or joy until he finally perished? Perhaps leaving them alive right now was foolish. Perhaps wishing they would get back up again was silly. But he didn't want it to end just yet. More. Another minute, another 10, another hour, he'd take everything he could and more if this would be the last moment of meaning in his life. So instead of moving to finish off the other dragon slayers, he moved towards the new arrival he could sense. He wasn't kind enough to merely allow them a chance to get up easily. If they died from this, then they wouldn't even have brought him any more joy, and he certainly wasn't willing to allow their healer to reach them without difficulty. Like the others, she had been steadily getting better at fighting him the longer the fight had dragged on. He wondered how far she could go in these last moments. His appearance came without much fanfare. It didn't stop them from showing terrified looks at him though. Well, almost all of them. And had reappeared too, the one dragon slayer he wouldn't mind killing here and now. There was playing and drawing the fight out, and then there was risking everything. With a cry of joy, and the screaming from Zeref for END to stop, he found the little fire demon rocketing up towards him at full speed, using one hand for propulsion while the other built up the flames that would strike him. His wings quickly began to beat, pushing him back out of the way and avoiding a flame-coated fist as it swung up at him. The demon passed him back, trying to turn in the air, but before he did he ensured he wouldn't get another chance to strike. With a loud roar, he used the shockwave to send the demon flying. Flames burst to life in greater quantities, managing to stop E.N.D's momentum but not before he had been flung far enough away. He already knew the demon would charge straight back at him, likely planning to sandwich him between two streams of flames when he got closer. He didn't have any intention to allow that to happen. Bending the claws of his hands inwards so they pointed towards a central point, he let his magic flow. An orb of pure energy quickly began to form, a condensed attack of raw power, before he fired all the magic forward in a wide beam. In response, END began to swing his arms forward, his flames trying to crush the attack from either side, but he had been a moment too slow to react. The beam hit him first, destroying his body and tearing him to pieces, leaving the flames to quickly burn out without the additional power being funneled into them. With the demon dead, at least for a time, he raised his hand up and formed another orb of pure white energy. This time though he didn't bother about condensing it or even about how much power it had. This time all that mattered was size. It continued to expand above his head, getting wider and wider until it was like a second sun in the sky to those below. Even if END isn't dead for good, he called down, watching how hundreds of characters were spilling out from the book of END and being replaced almost as quickly by the blue-haired girl. It takes time to restore him from being completely broken down. I reckon you can't even afford to move from that spot until you've managed to slow down his permanent destruction to one you can keep up with, am I wrong? He smirked as he got silence from the girl and a glare from Zeref. I'm right, aren't I? I reckon it'll take you around 20 seconds to stabilize him, and it'll take even longer to bring him back into fighting condition. A minute maybe? However, you can't run away this time. Not if I remove the darkness you'd love to slip into. Now then, he added, bringing his other hand out to the side and allowing strands of magic to form and twirl around his claws. I know you'll survive this, Zeref. But how about her? He frowned for a second when he noticed the blue-haired dragon slayer step in front of his target, wondering what she was even up to. Would she try a similar thing to what she did before? To force things to switch places? Her magic was unusual when she did such actions. It certainly wasn't the magic of a dragon slayer. Even so, he doubted she could do much to an attack like this. Perish, all of you. As his arm swung down, he noticed Zeref dart in front of the other two. Did he intend to shield them with his body? If so, he underestimated the range of this attack. It would tear right through him and ensure the others fell with him. That is what he had thought at least. Up until the point he saw a magic circle forming in the air before Zeref's hand, a smirk across his face. His attack connected directly with the seal and exploded against it, and yet in that moment he knew something had gone wrong. That his attack had not worked, despite the damage it had caused to the area around it. He was still trying to work out what Zeref had done when a blur shot out from the explosion and slammed into him, sending him flying further upwards. It quickly chased after him, easily caught out of the corner of his eye, and he had to recover quickly in time to block the follow-up strike, magic slamming into his body and causing the skin on the arm that he had used to block to the strike to ache. So that's what you did. I forgot about that technique of yours. Zeref merely continued to smirk back at him, held up in the air by wings made of darkness while magic that he could only describe as his danced across the dark mage's body, glowing brightly in his eyes. You really didn't think I would let you pull the same trick again? If you want to get to the book of END, I think you'll find it a bit harder this time. Very well. Let us see how long you can keep this up, you fake excuse for a dragon slayer. Protector of the fairies. You know he really should have said something if he could do something like that, Levy muttered, having managed to spare a few glances up at the ongoing battle when not dealing with some of the urgent repairs on the book of END. That would have really helped a long time ago. I'm not sure it would have, Wendy admitted, her eyes tracking the battle in the sky briefly. She managed to catch the sight of Zeref knocking Acknowledge across the sky with a massive blast of magic only for the dragon to lunge right back a second later and appear to rip Zeref's head off. At least that is what she assumed happened going by the strike. Zeref's immortality was too fast for her to know if it even happened at all. Zeref's dangerous but, as a dragon slayer, I'm not sure he's that skilled. As a dragon slayer. Levy paused for a moment, finally at the stage where she could split her focus and get a clear look at the fight above. Is that what's happening? I just thought he could fight properly and not just stay in the back. I didn't think he even knew dragon slayer magic. I don't think he does, acknowledged Wendy. At least he doesn't seem to have shown any indication of it before, and I think Ziref might have targeted him long ago if he truly was a dragon slayer. Besides that, I saw what he did with his magic when Aknologia attacked us. Mind enlightening me? I was getting prepared for the worst case scenario and almost was about to try and rely on Kakao, not that it would have helped much. And then I got more confused when you jumped in front of me too. So what did Ziref do? He mentioned to me before he'd have a countermeasure, but this isn't quite what I expected. It's kind of like my magic in a way, Wendy muttered softly. His magic tends to contradict itself in its focus. He has a mastery over death, but he also has enough knowledge about life that he can create it, even if the forms those creations take isn't one to help us. So while some of his magic is extremely far away from what mine is, some of it does tend to lighter purposes. And how does that relate to yours? Nervously glancing at the flow of energy she could see in the sky, Wendy focused on it as she continued explaining. Sky magic is closely linked to magic. We can see it, and doing that also allows us to pull the souls held in it back into our world. I did that once with a dragon's soul, brought them back into our world, and was able to talk to them. They are just souls those, so they can't stay for long without a material form to rest in, but they are still brought back thanks to my magic. Again, how does what Ziref did relate to your magic? We also drew from magic, Wendy stated. At least that is how it looked to my eyes. He might not have been drawing from the flow of magic, but the seal he was using must have been directly inspired by the ones I use for summoning. I think I even recognized some of the symbols in fact. It does differ though, she admitted. My version is based on filtering as it's trying to bring back a single or a select few souls. His was very much about letting as much through as possible. Where I try and search for what I want, he doesn't care and accepts everything. And where I just let them manifest, to appear in the world, he compresses it down into a shape. Himself. He absorbed Aknologia's attack. Levy frowned. Well, I suppose he couldn't just let it hang around like a soul would. It wouldn't have the will to manifest properly, right? Wendy nodded. Yeah. Still, what he's done is really risky. And dangerous. If it was a soul that he absorbed in this way, what would occur would be more like possession. Or maybe fusion. I'm honestly not too sure what would occur if it was done this way. You said it was risky, right? Levy asked, taking her eyes away from the battle to return her full focus to the book. Some extra damage had accumulated in that time, but it was easily repaired. The only reason she hadn't probably Natsu back properly yet was that she wanted to try and unleash him against Aknologia at the right moment. What are the risks? If they aren't too bad, I might try and get Ziref to do the same thing to me that he did to himself. You shouldn't, Wendy said quickly, panic spreading across her face. Your body won't be able to handle it. You'll die. Huh? But he's... Levy paused in her words, realizing the answer. Ziref's dying. Wendy nodded. Yes. He begins to die, and then B becomes fine again. But if it had been anyone else... Ziref's immortality is powerful. He can take risks that would destroy others entirely purely because he can't be destroyed. Taking in Aknologia's magic should have destroyed him. It's wild, powerful, dangerous, and above all it was a tremendous amount of magical power. And Ziref absorbed it all in one instant. If it was anyone else, their body would have exploded. And as it stands, I'm sure it is beginning to wear him down, even if it can't kill him. So how long can he keep this up? He's using a finite source of energy, right? Levy glanced up to find Wendy staring at her silently. What? No, you're right. I don't need your eyes to be able to work stuff out. He absorbed the energy, but there's no way that's a permanent fix when all he took in was magic. No matter what has changed, that is still Aknologia's magic is using. Any magic he replenishes himself is not going to be shaped into Dragon Slayer magic, which means the amount of Dragon Slayer magic he can use is limited to the amount of energy he absorbed. That's probably why he waited until now thinking about it. He didn't want to waste this chance unless he was getting a huge amount of power in exchange, since I doubt Aknologia will allow him to do the same thing twice. Did I get anything wrong? Wendy shook her head before turning her attention back towards Ziref, just in time to see him unleash a massive blast across the sky. Acknowledge barely dodged it, the blast soaring over his head, before he lashed out with a hand and unleashed a wave of energy of his own right through Ziref's chest. No, that's right. Even now I can tell Ziref's not as strong as he started. He's trying to cover that weakness with attacks, but I'm sure Acknowledge knows this won't last forever. I'm probably one of the only people who can tell how long he has left, and if he continues at the rate he's going he'll exhaust all the energy he took into his body in 5 minutes' time. 5 minutes. That's not long, Levy muttered. END is ready to go anytime now. I just need to restore his mental functions and he'll wake back up. Not sure where he is though, so I hope he manages to spot Acknowledge in the sky and charges him again. At least this time Acknowledge won't be able to focus down on him with Ziref in the way. Can you make it to the others? Do you know where they are? I saw them, Wendy muttered weakly, faintly remembering the sight of their broken bodies. I don't know how much I can heal them though in the time we've got. Just do your best to make sure they stay alive. After that. Levy sighed, but Wendy could tell she was struggling to hold on to hope. She could relate. We'll figure something out. God knows what, but we'll manage somehow. Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.